And welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. People are still sort of wandering in, but we want to keep things on time for you all today who showed up on time because we appreciate you. I'm Catherine Hoffman. I am the CEO of the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. Welcome to our CLE celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. We're very excited for the presentations we're going to present to you today. I do want to thank Mehmet Konar-Steenberg, Professor Konar-Steenberg here at Mitchell Hamline, and Mitchell Hamline for hosting us. Really appreciate it. We have 3 sessions for you today. The first one is Clean Water Act 101, the basics of the law. The second one is specifically focuses on agriculture, which remains a big pollution problem here in Minnesota and across the country, in the ways in which the Clean Water Act does and does not regulate it. And then our third session will be some new and emerging hot topics in clean water law. So those are our 3 panels. We are recording here today as well as broadcasting over Zoom. So thank you and welcome to those of you who are with us remotely. And we do have a happy hour afterwards. So stick around afterwards and there'll be an opportunity to mingle and get to talk to the other guests as well as the MCEA staff who are here today. So Q&A, the way we're going to do questions and answers today are written. So you have some index cards and pens on the tables in front of you. So if you do have questions, write them there and then pass them towards the middle. We are not able to take questions from the online audience with the setup. I apologize. That is the price you pay for joining us from your couch at home. We're still happy to have you. So, all right. That's how we'll do at least 10 minutes of Q&A at the end of each panel session. So we will make time for your questions. All right, our first panel today, Clean Water Act 101. We have 3 panelists. We have Joy Anderson, who is a supervising attorney at MCEA, Olivia Carroll, who is a student director of the Environmental Law Clinic at the University of Minnesota Law School, and Lee Curry, who is our Director of Strategic Litigation at MCEA. So I'm going to hand it off to Joy, who's going to start here today. And really, I meant Lee, who's going to start here today.
Director of Strategic Litigation, and my mic is now on. For this first session that I'm going to kick off, we are going to hopefully give you a foundation of the Clean Water Act that will help you throughout the rest of the day. So sort of a Clean Water Act 101. So I'm going to start off with a history of the Act and a little bit about the cooperative federalism framework under which the Clean Water Act operates. Olivia is going to talk about the scope of the Act, what is and is not regulated, what activities are and are not prohibited. And then Joy is going to talk a little bit about the implementation basics, how the Clean Water Act works on the ground. And then, as Catherine mentioned, we will hold some time for Q&A at the end. So please do send your questions along. So I'm going to go way back to start us off. We're going to start in 1899, with the Rivers and Harbors Act. And this was really the first federal law that ultimately did address water pollution, although it was not designed to do so. The purpose of the Rivers and Harbors Act was to protect navigable waters for navigation, for commerce in the United States. But it became known as the Refuse Act because it prohibited, quote, any refuse matter of any kind or description whatever, other than that flowing from streets and sewers and passing therefrom in a liquid state. So as you can see from the picture, this Rivers and Harbors Act did not prohibit all discharges. The picture is a 1927 outfall into the Mississippi River that discharged over 1.5 million gallons of raw sewage every day directly into the Mississippi, which was all allowed under the Rivers and Harbors Act. But it did prohibit discharges that would interrupt navigation. And then in 1960, there was a U.S. Supreme Court case, United States versus Republic Steel Corporation, where the Supreme Court interpreted the Rivers and Harbors Act as prohibiting discharges that not only interrupted navigation, but all discharges that met the definition of refuse under the Act. Following that, around 1970, a Wisconsin congressman saw the potential in the Citizen Enforcement Clause under the Rivers and Harbors Act. So this act allowed citizens to sue anyone who was violating the act and receive half of whatever fine was collected. And so this Wisconsin congressman identified 270 polluters that were violating the Rivers and Harbors Act that ultimately led to several hundred lawsuits. And although the fine collected wasn't great, what it did was it really it gave the polluters, the dischargers, an incentive to want some sort of comprehensive permitting program so that they weren't subjected to these citizen enforcement suits. So that really laid the groundwork for what ultimately would become the Clean Water Act. So we're going to fast forward about half a century to 1948. And this was the first attempt to really address water pollution per se. So not as an accidental byproduct of protecting navigation, but there was increased recognition in the post-World War II era that water pollution in and of itself was becoming a major problem. As an example, it was reported in 1945 that 3,500 communities pumped 2.5 billion tons of raw sewage into our lakes, streams, and coastal waters each day. So there was a need to do something. This early attempt, though, this 1948 version, was not very effective. For one thing, it didn't specifically prohibit any discharges, any pollution. It didn't actually prohibit or set standards against any polluting activities. What it really did was set up the federal government to provide technical services and grants to the state, but it didn't actually regulate water pollution. And then it did declare pollution of interstate waters to be a public nuisance, but it had this really cumbersome enforcement mechanism. So if it was found that the health or welfare of persons in a state other than the state in which the discharge was originating, if the health and welfare of this other state was affected, the Surgeon General of the United States could bring a lawsuit, but only with permission of the state where the discharge was originating. So effectively, it gave the states full veto power over any federal action, and not surprisingly, there was basically zero enforcement of the 1948 law. And a few things started happening in the public, in the public eye at this point. So many of you might be familiar with the Cuyahoga River and its influence on the Clean Water Act. The river actually caught fire, in fact, many times over the years, and we're going to cue up a clip coming up from James Earl Jones in 1978 that talks about the Cuyahoga River and its influence on the act. My tech guy is going to play the clip.
But the Cuyahoga always has been and must be a working river, we also want her for our pleasures, recreation, and as a thing of beauty. She has remained low profile through our lifetimes. Despite the tremendous industrial development, few events of memorable significance have taken place on her waters or on her banks. With all the clamor and din of mills, refineries, factories, the river has gone about her business quietly and has been taken for granted. She received some publicity in 1936 when a spark from a blowtorch being used to dismantle a boat ignited floating waste, burning for 5 days. The fire was extinguished and the river lapsed back into obscurity. But over 30 years later, in 1969, another fire, and the Cuyahoga, a relative unknown, became an overnight sensation. The pollution problem received national attention. Time magazine reported shortly after the incident, some river, chocolate brown, oily, bubbling with subsurface gases, it oozes rather than flows. Anyone who falls into the Cuyahoga does not drown, Cleveland citizens joke grimly, he decays. All joking aside, the situation was indeed grim. Pollution has been an intrinsic part of the river's history. It's a problem that could not be rectified overnight, but a problem that in recent years has been studied as a priority.
Okay, so we're back on track now with the slides. So yeah, he does a much better job than I would do of giving you the gravity of the situation that our country was facing in the late 1960s, early 1970s. So that really teed up the congressional action in 1972 for what we now call the Clean Water Act, although it was technically a set of amendments to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act that was originally passed in 1948. So the goal of the Clean Water Act, the policy or the purpose, was to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And it included some very lofty goals. So, for example, by 1983, the Act declared that we would have fishable and swimmable waters. And by 1985, we would achieve a final goal of no pollution discharged into waters of the United States. So, like I said, some pretty lofty goals set up in the 1972 amendments to the Act. What the Clean Water Act did was it gave the Environmental Protection Agency, the federal agency, the authority to implement a water pollution control system, to set up a permitting system for all discharges into waters of the United States. It made it unlawful for any person to discharge from a point source, which Olivia is going to talk a little bit more about what that means, into navigable waters, which, as we talked about, was sort of the underpinnings of water protection in our country. It funded construction of sewage treatment plants, and it recognized the need for planning to address more diffuse and widespread sources of pollution that we call non-point source pollution, but it didn't directly address those sources. So I'm going to walk through a couple of the major amendments to the Act. The first being in 1977. So backing up a little bit, just on the heels of the passage of this major set of amendments in 1972, the EPA attempted to exempt certain agricultural sources of pollution from the permitting system. It said, these sources don't need to go through the permitting system. That was challenged, and the DC Circuit in 75 reversed the EPA's attempt to do that and said, no, the Act is clear. These are point sources. They have to be regulated under the Act. So Congress stepped in 1977. And one of the major amendments of that time was to exempt agricultural stormwater discharges and return flows from agriculture. So essentially, the water flowing off the farmlands was exempt from the permitting system in the Clean Water Act. The 1977 amendments also completed mid-course corrections, they say, and gave attention to the control of toxic pollutants that was needed more attention, and then it committed to full funding of the construction grant program. The next set of major amendments was 1987. This was the first attempt to really address this non-point source pollution that Olivia will talk about a little more. These amendments encouraged states to address groundwater pollution. The Act still, on the federal level, did not address groundwater pollution. And these 87 amendments established the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So briefly, in my last slide here, I just want to touch on the framework under which the Clean Water Act operates. So it's a common framework for environmental statutes in our country. It's called cooperative federalism. And essentially, the federal government sets the standards, the guidelines by which then states can do the day-to-day implementation and enforcement of the regulation. So there's a cooperation between the federal and the state government. Originally, tribes did not qualify as states under the Act, and you'll hear more about this in our third panel, more detail. But amendments have since been made which allow tribes to apply for treatment as a state. So states and tribes can set their own water quality standards under the Clean Water Act, and they must be at least as strict as the federal standards, but they can go beyond the federal standards. So the Clean Water Act acts as a floor, and then the states can go above that. If the states do not apply for delegated authority, or the EPA rejects their attempt to receive delegated authority, the EPA will still administer the permitting program in lieu of the states. But in Minnesota, we are a delegated state. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Olivia, who's going to talk a little bit more about the scope of the Clean Water Act.
Thank you. So just to quickly reintroduce myself, I'm Olivia Carroll, and as Lee said, I'll be talking about the Clean Water Act scope. So the scope is going to be looking at what bodies of water and what actions are we allowed to regulate under the Clean Water Act. And as Lee mentioned, there are several functions the Clean Water Act provides, including things like construction grant programs for building out infrastructure. But the main function that we're going to be discussing, and also that the Clean Water Act is mostly known for, is really this broad prohibition for the discharge of any pollutant by any person into navigable waters. And as any good lawyer will tell you, that sentence is really not super meaningful on its own. We have to go in and look at the key terms there to break down exactly what that sentence means for the scope. So the three key phrases we're going to look at are pollutant, which is going to be discussing what kinds of substances are considered pollutants under the Act. Discharge, which is looking at the method that pollutants are entering waters that we're going to regulate under the Clean Water Act. And then finally, navigable waters, probably the most difficult of the three terms to really pinpoint, and that's looking at exactly what bodies of water the Clean Water Act regulates. So starting off with pollutants, more straightforward of a term, it's defined under the Clean Water Act in Section 502. And as you can see, it's got kind of a lengthy, fairly broad enumerated definition, includes things like dredged spoil, sewage, garbage, chemical waste, biological materials. So a pretty extensive list. There are two enumerated exceptions to pollutants, and that is sewage from vessels, which is also further defined in another section of the Clean Water Act, as well as water, gas, or other materials used to facilitate the production of oil or gas. But otherwise, overall, pollutants, pretty straightforward, pretty broad definition under the Clean Water Act. The next term, discharges, is also defined under the Act. So a discharge of a pollutant is any addition of any pollutant to navigable waters from any point source. And the key phrase here being from any point source. As Lee said, well, what is a point source? And that, luckily, also defined by definition under the Clean Water Act. So a point source is any discernible, confined, and discrete conveyance, including but not limited to a pipe, ditch, channel, a discrete fissure, well, from which pollutants are or may be discharged. So again, a pretty broad-seeming definition, has quite a few different vessels in there. A picture on the slide is showing sort of what a quintessential idea of what a point source is. Two pipes leading wastewater into a body of water. So again, pretty straightforward definition. And I will say that Lee mentioned a 1977 amendment that excluded stormwater discharges from agriculture, as well as return flows from irrigated agriculture. And that does have some significance, which I'll talk about a little on the next slide, but that exception is included in this definition of what a point source is not. So the Act defines what a point source is, and that's what is a discharge that is regulated under the Act. But the Act does not define, in particular, what a non-point source is, and that's going to be anything that is not a point source. So non-point sources are dispersed activities over large areas and really not traceable to a single discrete source like a point source is. And there's two pictures on the slide again. The first one kind of quintessential idea of what a non-point source is, and that's that agricultural land that is excluded from being a point source. So when water hits that from irrigation or from rainfall, it's going to take with it the chemicals on the land, and that is considered a non-point source. Now, noting here that that's significant because agricultural pollution is now really the #1 source of water contamination in the US, and that's a topic that will be discussed a little more in detail, or a lot more in detail, in the second hour by Carly Griffith and Ann Cohen. But partly because of the success of regulating point sources in the Clean Water Act, now non-point sources are really the #1 greatest threat to US water's quality. The second image is of a stormwater drain, just your average stormwater drain in any community or neighborhood. And again, that's considered non-discernible, really where the pollution is coming from, so another non-point source. And again, noting amendments that Lee had already mentioned in 1987 that does add the regulation of some stormwater when it relates to large industrial facilities. Congress realized that you could kind of discern more when there's a large facility where that pollution is coming from, and those require a permit for both during the construction phase of the facility as well as while the facility is in use, and also pollution prevention plans that detail how the facility will attempt some mitigation. Okay, so those are the terms pollutant and discharge, but now we're gonna go to the more cumbersome term of what is a navigable water, and that's looking at, again, the bodies of water that are actually gonna be regulated under the Clean Water Act. So navigable waters, the phrase itself is defined under Section 502, but mostly unhelpfully as waters of the United States and territorial seas. So we'll deal with the latter half of that sentence first. Territorial seas is also defined under the Act, the definition on the slide, basically a portion of the sea off the coastline. But the first part of that definition, waters of the United States, as it's often referred to as WOTUS, I'll try to not abbreviate it and call it waters of the US, but if I do, it's WOTUS. That is not defined by statute. So that definition has had sort of a wacky and complicated history in the last several decades of agencies, courts trying to really define exactly what that means. And we'll do a brief history of that quickly, but in the third hour, there'll be a much more detailed discussion of that in relation to a current Supreme Court case. So stay tuned for that, for more of a background on what WOTUS is. But before we get into WOTUS, just quickly, we can delineate a couple other aspects of what navigable waters are or aren't. The first is that navigable waters applies only to surface water. It does not apply to groundwater. There's a potential small caveat to that not applying to groundwater in terms of a recent Supreme Court decision, but we'll talk about that at the end. Otherwise, generally, does not apply to groundwater. And it also, the Clean Water Act does not apply to drinking water. The Safe Drinking Water Act, enacted in 1974, covers drinking water, so we can rule that out for what the Clean Water Act regulates. Okay, so in 1982, the EPA and US Army Corps of Engineers attempted to take a first stab at defining exactly what WOTUS was. And they came up with a list of waters that would be included in the definition of WOTUS. I think instead of just going through them, it might be a little more helpful to see a small diagram and then go through them. So I'll try to work with this picture here. And initially just ignoring the legend and text of what that says, just to see what the bodies of water are. So the first thing that they included was traditional navigable waters. So as Lee mentioned, navigable waters kind of came even before the Clean Water Act as a phrase talking about any waters that a ship could navigate on. So you can see the large dark blue in the middle is a traditional navigable water like a large river. You also have territorial seas at the bottom. So those two things are included, and those are pretty easily defined. The 1982 rule also included all interstate waters, so any waters that were crossing state lines, and generally all other waters that could affect interstate or foreign commerce. That initially encompassed quite a few waters, or it was unclear whether it did, but it could apply to quite a few different bodies of water. You also have, looking at this map, wetlands that are either connected to a navigable water or adjacent to a navigable water, or connected or adjacent to a tributary to a navigable water. Those were initially included in the definition of the 1982 WOTUS definition, as well as impoundments, which are man-made collections of waters like reservoirs, tributaries, which are smaller streams or lakes connected to the larger streams and lakes. And that was generally the definition in 1982. There are a couple changes in the following years that came mostly from the Supreme Court in 3 major decisions. Again, that'll be talked about in a little more detail in the third hour, but just to quickly outline what some of those changes are so you get an idea of how back and forth the definition of WOTUS has gone. So the first one in 1985, if you look at the top of this image, you can see adjacent wetlands is highlighted. So if you have a wetland that's next to a navigable water, it can either be connected with surface water, or it can have no connection to no surface water connection to the navigable water. And this 1985 Supreme Court decision determined that adjacent waters, even if they didn't have that surface connection, would also be considered as WOTUS under the Clean Water Act. Another decision in 2001 then decided that isolated wetlands and ponds, which if you look on the outskirts, kind of hard to see, they're very light gray. Those are any wetland or pond that is located a lot further from a navigable water or a jurisdictional water under WOTUS. And this 2001 decision determined that those were not going to be included under the Clean Water Act as waters of the US. And then the third most recent Supreme Court decision is also kind of the most confusing one. In 2006, the court fractured and came out with a 4-4-1 vote plurality decision, which determined in that case that wetlands adjacent to non-navigable water tributaries to a navigable water, so that's going to be those offshoot tributaries that are not themselves navigable if they have a wetland next to them, those are not considered waters of the United States under the Clean Water Act. So while that was a plurality decision, 2 tests came out of it because it was a 4-4 decision. Generally, the takeaway from that is that it was really unclear what the test would be going forward to determine whether or not a water was a navigable water. And a lot of these, if you can see on here in the light gray, were to be then determined on a case-by-case basis, which does not create a ton of certainty in the regulatory field. So here's another diagram, and if you kind of compare the color change going back and forth, in 2015, after these decisions, the EPA and Army Corps attempt to draft a new definition, sort of based on the 1982 initial definition, plus these new Supreme Court decisions being added in. And this becomes a little more inclusive. It's now going to consider, it adds in these distances that, if a wetland is close enough to a non-navigable tribute to a navigable water, then it can be considered WOTUS. So it takes some of that unsurety out. The case-by-case basis is no longer used. But unfortunately, this rule is scheduled to take effect on August 28th, 2015, and 32 states sued to prevent that rule from taking effect. So we didn't really have a lot of time to implement it. And then in 2016, Trump entered office. And by 2017, announced that he, in an executive order, would be enacting a new rule to redefine, once again, what waters of the United States were. So now on the screen, you can see, again, a quick color comparison. A lot less waters are going to be covered as water of the U.S. under this new Trump rule. There was a statistic from the EPA that said about 18% of streams and 51% of wetlands in the U.S. wouldn't be covered by the new rule. I have since heard even higher numbers than that, but the rule would significantly draw back a lot of waters that would have been covered. But again, that rule didn't really have time to go into effect for very long, because when President Biden entered office, his first day in office, he issued an executive order revoking that rule. So if going through that did anything, I hope it really confused you. I'm sure it probably did. Hopefully not just because of my explaining, but mostly because the rule really has been quite confusing, quite complex, and unclear over the last few decades. The EPA and U.S. Army Corps currently uses the pre-2015 definition, and as I said, this will be discussed a lot more in detail and hopefully a little clearer in the third hour when discussing the Sackett versus EPA case, which was argued last month before the Supreme Court, and we're waiting for a decision there. Okay, so finally, the last aspect to turn to. As I mentioned, groundwater is not covered under the Clean Water Act for the most part. So mostly groundwater is regulated at a state level using state laws. But in a recent 2020 Supreme Court decision in County of Maui versus Hawaii Wildlife Fund, the Supreme Court actually determined that some groundwater could play a part in the Clean Water Act. So in the County of Maui is a county in Hawaii, and it discharged wastewater from a wastewater treatment plant through 4 wells that went underground into groundwater. But that groundwater then traveled less than half a mile to go into the Pacific Ocean. So ostensibly, it was going directly into groundwater and almost immediately then flowing right into the ocean, which is a territorial sea and a water of the United States. And in this case, the county tried to argue that injections into groundwater were not considered a violation of the Clean Water Act because the groundwater isn't regulated under the act. And actually, the Supreme Court decided, no, they were wrong. And you do require a permit under the Clean Water Act when you convey a discharge of pollutant into a navigable water by a non-point source. So in making this decision, the court created what is now referred to as the functional equivalent test. So I have up here 8 factors. So basically the court said if your discharge into a non-point source, into groundwater, is the functional equivalent of discharging into that point source or into that navigable water, then that can be regulated under the Clean Water Act. And there's 8 factors that the court would weigh in determining whether or not this was a functional equivalent. The first 2 factors, the time it takes and the distance the water has to travel before it gets to that navigable water, are the 2 most important factors the court was considering, but then they also weigh the other factors to determine whether or not that is a functional equivalent. And before I turn this over to Joy, I will just note that this functional equivalence test and the Maui decision, again, was decided in 2020, so fairly recently. And before it was decided, there was several circuit splits on whether or not groundwater would be included in this capacity. The Sixth Circuit being one of the circuits that said groundwater under no circumstances could be considered under the Clean Water Act. So this decision will have some impact in even pending litigation in Minnesota itself to determine whether or not now there are violations or under the Clean Water Act or permits are needed under the Clean Water Act. So, and I will turn this over to Joy.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and I'm Joy Anderson. And now that we've talked about, thank you, Olivia. Now that we've talked about the history and scope of the Clean Water Act and what the goals are, I want to talk a little bit about how the Act actually accomplishes those goals. So, the Act is based on an idea about water quality standards. First, you have to define what you want your water to look like, and then you have to figure out how to get the water to meet that standard. So there are 4 steps that we're going to talk about. First, you have to develop the water quality standards. How clean do you want your water to be? Then you have to measure the water conditions that exist and identify the waters that don't actually meet what you want the water to be. Then after that, you calculate how the water bodies can reach the water quality standards that you want them to meet. And then finally, you issue permits that limit the pollutants that can go into those water bodies. And hopefully you watch your water become cleaner and cleaner. That's how it's supposed to work. So first, what are water quality standards, the thing on which this whole system rests? So they are identifying the condition that you want your waters to be in. They are set by the state, and then the federal EPA approves them. And they have three components to them. First of all, you have to take each water body and say, what is this water body used for? What is its designated use? Is it used for fishing and swimming? Is it used for aquatic life? Is it used for agricultural and industrial use? You pick what the use of that water is. And then you say, okay, based on the use that we have here, what do we want this water to look like? What are the criteria that we have for this water? How clean should it be? And those criteria can be either numeric. You can have 10 parts per million of sulfate in your water, or they can be narrative. They can describe what you want your water to look like. Then the third component that we have is an anti-degradation standard, which protects existing uses and sort of sets a floor and says, you've got this use for the water right now. You can't pollute it so much that you can't use it for that anymore. That's the anti-degradation standard. So once you have set, okay, this is what we want our water quality to look like, then you have to identify the waters that don't meet that standard. And you do this by creating an impaired waters list. So every 2 years, the state or a tribe or whoever the delegated authority is has to evaluate all available water quality for all the water bodies that they have every 2 years. This is a huge undertaking. And then using that data, they have to develop a list of waters that don't meet the water quality standards, that based on their use and based on what the criteria are, they don't meet that. And then you report that list to the EPA, and the EPA either approves or disapproves the state list. As an example of how this works, in 2020, Minnesota's impaired waters list was disapproved in part by the EPA because it didn't include waters that were impaired for sulfate based on a specific standard that is meant to protect wild rice. So, for years and years, Minnesota had this standard on the books that is meant to protect wild rice in waters that are specifically wild rice waters, waters that are used to grow wild rice. But MCEA hadn't enforced that standard and hadn't listed any waters for that. So finally, EPA said, look, you've got this standard on the books, you've got to list waters for it. And so it disapproved Minnesota's 2020 list and said, you've got to add some of these waters on here. So in the end, MCEA had to add 33 waters based on the wild rice standard that were not previously on its impaired waters list. So once you have determined that your waters are not meeting the standards that they are supposed to, then what do? You have to create a cleanup plan, a way to figure out how to get that water quality from where it's at to where you want it to be. And that is called a total maximum daily load, or TMDL. And like Olivia, I will try not to be spouting out acronyms, but I may say TMDL, and that's what it is. So these have to be established by the state for every single water body on the impaired waters list. And it's meant to help restore water quality. So what you do is you say, okay, this water body has too much sulfate or whatever based on the water quality standards that we have for this body of water. So we have to figure out how to get less sulfate in that water. So they calculate how much sulfate can flow into that water body every day, the total maximum daily load, and still keep that water underneath the water quality standard that has been set. Once you've got that amount calculated, you can allocate what the amount of pollution that is allowed to go into the water among the different sources that you have that create that pollutant. So then you've got the cleanup plan, which is step number 3 that we're talking about. Step number 4 is implementation. Just because you have a plan doesn't mean that the water automatically becomes clean. So now you have to make changes based on this cleanup plan that you have created. There are a couple ways to do this. So one of the problems is that the TMDL itself, the cleanup plan, is not just self-enforcing. You can create a cleanup plan, doesn't mean your water automatically gets cleaner. And so first you need to have an implementation plan. Part of the problem is that these don't always get created. I just looked at the MCEA website, and there are more than 100 TMDLs that do not have a specific implementation plan to go along with them. So that's one disconnect, unfortunately. The other disconnect is that, as we've been talking about already, especially Olivia talked about this, the Clean Water Act covers point sources. It covers wastewater treatment plants and industrial facilities and large industrial farms, places where you can say, we know where this pollution is coming from. There's a pipe that's spouting out wastewater. There's some other kind of discrete conveyance that is creating the pollution. For those, the implementation process is pretty clear. You get a water discharge permit, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. And the permit limits how much pollutant that point source can put out. But for non-point sources, for the stormwater drain that Olivia had on her slide, for the agricultural runoff that we'll be talking about in the next hour, those things don't have a water discharge permit. And so you have limited tools that can get you to clean up that pollution. There are some tools that can be used. Best management practices talk about, okay, this is a good way to apply this chemical or spread this fertilizer or whatever. There are specific state regulations that help with these things. There are incentive programs where you pay people to act in a cleaner way, but the Clean Water Act's tools for addressing non-point source pollution are limited. Okay, so let's talk about the tool that we do have, which is the water discharge permit. And again, we've got another fun acronym here, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System Permit. You'll hear people refer to these as NPDES permits. So that's, if people say that, really what it means is a permit that allows you to discharge pollutants into water. So this really implements the main rule of the Clean Water Act that Olivia was talking about. You can't discharge into a navigable water without a permit. And this is the permit you need to get. So these permits set limits on how much pollutants are allowed to be in your discharge. And they last for 5 years, and then they're renewed. Mostly they are issued by the states. This is a huge program. Nationwide, there are 65,000 of these permits, mostly for industrial and wastewater treatment facilities. And then there are also, as Olivia mentioned, the Clean Water Act now does cover some stormwater discharges, and there are about 150,000 stormwater NPDES permits. What kinds of limitations are in these permits? Again, we've got more acronyms, so fun. So the first one is the technology-based effluent limits. You'll hear these referred to as T-bells. And these are nationwide standards that are set by the EPA based on the technology that is available to treat water. So the EPA will say, okay, we know that there's this treatment that you can use that will get your water to this level of cleanness, and everyone's got to apply that. You just have to. But a lot of times those are not sufficient to make sure that the discharge will cause rivers downstream or water bodies downstream to meet the water quality standards that have been set. And so when that happens, there are these stricter limitations called water quality based effluent limits, WQ bells, or even just Q bells, because we love our acronyms in environmental law. And they are more stringent than the technology-based limits, and they are intended to make sure that you meet your water quality standards downstream. And these are really interesting because they are technology forcing. The government says, we don't care how you get there. We don't care if there's not even a technology to make the water this clean. You've got to figure it out. You've got to get your discharge to the point where it's not going to violate the water quality standards downstream. Again, at least that's the idea. Doesn't always work that way in practice. So that is the water quality-based system that drives a lot of the Clean Water Act. And it really has made significant improvements to water quality. We are not seeing burning rivers, you're not seeing the kinds of things that were in that beautiful James Earl Jones clip that we watched earlier, where you stick your hand in the water and it comes up black. That stuff is not happening anymore. But there are still problems with water pollution, in part because of the non-point source stuff that we've talked about. So before I end, I want to change gears here because there is another type of pollution that we haven't really been talking about. Olivia showed you the definition of pollutants under the Clean Water Act, and one of the first one was dredged spoil. It's like all the stuff you dig out of a river, or like the rock and sand and things like that. Those are not really regulated by NPDES permits. For those, if you want to fill in a water of the United States, you have to get what's called a Section 404 permit. So these regulate when you want to fill in a water of the United States, which is really complicated, whether it is or not, and mostly it applies in the case of wetlands, because that's what people are filling in to build dams, to build roads, to do development, to have agricultural land. So these are largely wetlands fill permits. And this is a really interesting change because wetlands used to be considered just basically unprofitable swamps, right? What can we do with a swamp? The best thing is to fill it in and make it productive land. So DNR says that Minnesota has lost 90% of its native wetlands due to things like agricultural fill-in. But now, with the Clean Water Act, people are recognizing, no, actually wetlands have a lot of really important functions. They provide habitat for waterfowl. They provide a whole bunch of ecological services. They clean the water. They stop flooding. They stop erosion. Wetlands are really important. And that's a useful change that has happened with the Clean Water Act. So what is the standard for these Section 404, the wetlands fill permits? The standard in the statute is that discharge will not be allowed if a practical, less damaging alternative exists, or the nation's waters would be significantly degraded. And this sounds like a really high standard, right? But in practice, people are going to own the property that they want to be developing, and they don't have a lot of alternative. That's the piece of property that they own. They can't go, well, they could go around and look for a different place to build whatever they're building, but it's not considered to be practical alternative. So in practice, what a permittee must actually show in order to get a 404 permit is that steps have been taken to avoid impacts. Did you try to look around and see if there's another place you could put it? That potential impacts have been minimized through design. You build a stormwater pond. You make sure that your runoff is contained, things like that. And that compensatory mitigation will be provided for impacts that can't be avoided. And that is mostly building artificial wetlands somewhere else. So that is the end of our presentation. We didn't get quite 10 minutes for questions, but if you have questions, please turn them in to Catherine, and we would be delighted to answer anything that you might have. I should have talked faster. It looks like we have a lot of questions, but we will do our best to get to all of them.
All right. We have a lot of functional equivalents.
Oh boy. If you're asking things about functional equivalent, the answer is that maybe no one knows.
Okay, here's one. Where are things standing now in the sulfate water regulation issue? Do you know that one?
Yes. So if you're talking about the changes to the impaired waters list that we were talking about, so in 2020, Minnesota had to add those 32 waters to the impaired waters list. For the next impaired waters list, it had to add another 3 or 2. So I think in total there's 35 new waters that have been added to the impaired waters list. So now we have to go through that whole process. The state has to do TMDLs for these waters, the total daily maximum load plan, where you determine how are we going to get our water to the correct water quality standard, and then put the limits into permits, hopefully. But that is a long process, which we haven't gotten to the end of that yet.
Thanks, Joy. So this is a question about what do we do with the lack of implementation plans? Does that mean there's no enforcement available? And the lack of the implementation plan, and Joy, you can correct me if I've got this wrong, but goes to the TMDL, the total maximum daily load. It doesn't mean, however, that you don't need a NIPD's permit, or that you don't have the technology-based effluent limitation or a water quality-based effluent limitation. So there are still enforcement mechanisms to regulate discharges even without an implementation plan to figure out exactly how we're going to clean up this particular water body to the standard we'd like to see it.
Yeah, and sorry if I was unclear about that, but it did really strike me when I looked at the MCEA page, and there's this whole long list of TMDLs, and then there's a whole long column for implementation plans, and a lot of them don't have implementation plans. But again, that doesn't mean that there aren't tools that you can use to make things better.
Okay, so if states are setting the water quality standards, how do we know that they are not below the federal standards? What are the state standards compared to?
So they have to be based on updated science, and there is a whole comment period where you can get public input. Actually, MCEA has started some new standard making processes right now. They didn't do the nitrate one, so now I forget what one.
Ammonia. They're updating the class 2 standard for ammonia. So pollutants going into class 2 waters, which, as Joy said, is step 1 is to figure out what is this water being used for. Class 2 is for aquatic life, and MCEA is in the process of updating that standard. And it is actually basing its proposed new ammonia standard on an EPA recommendation. So the federal government does make those initial recommendations, and that's what states are held to. Yeah, and Catherine's saying it's possible to challenge the states, what they set, if you don't agree. And EPA has to approve any new state standard. So it sort of has that checks and balances built in. And yeah, let's do one more. Yeah. Okay, how can non-point sources be regulated if they don't fall under the scope of the Clean Water Act? Are they informal? Olivia, do you want
to? So as Joy mentioned, there is some, while they don't require permits for discharges of pollutants, there is some kind of regulation under the Clean Water Act still. But otherwise, I think like state laws are important for regulating non-point sources. Also, as Lee mentioned, there is like the encouragement of states to regulate more groundwater pollution. So widely, it's, I think, left to the state.
Yeah, and I think we'll hear more about that in our second hour, which is probably a good segue to thank you all for your attention and your questions. And we'll take a short break before our second panel. And Catherine might have a few words.
Yeah, there's some snacks in the back, and we will reconvene at 2:10. All right, you're all so quiet. Thanks for keeping us on time today. All right, so our first hour focused on what the Clean Water Act does well and how it's been set up to operate. Our second hour is going to focus on some of the challenges of the Clean Water Act that remain today. So I'm going to hand it off to our first speaker, Carly Griffith, who is MCEA's Water Program Director.
Thank you, Catherine. Can you all hear me through the mic here? Okay. So I want to reiterate Catherine's note of welcome and thank you all for being here today. I am Carly Griffith, as of last month, the Water Program Director at MCEA. I'm very happy to be here. And our panel covers how the Clean Water Act regulates, or in this case, doesn't regulate agriculture. So the Clean Water Act, which is arguably our most important federal framework to protect our waters, does not apply to many types of agricultural activity because it is considered what is called a non-point source of pollution, which we heard in the previous panel. So to start us off, I'm going to explain the sources of agricultural pollution that are considered non-point sources and how the Clean Water Act treats them differently. So I'll get to some of the questions about what the Clean Water Act does say about non-point sources in my portion of the presentation. Next, Ann Cohen, who's a senior staff attorney at MCEA, will cover how concentrated animal feedlots are regulated as point sources under the Clean Water Act. And then finally, Stephanie Fitzgerald, who's a staff attorney at MCEA, will review agricultural drainage systems as a source of water pollution and case law developments about the extent to which the Clean Water Act does apply to them. This is our panel. So let's begin with you're going to see this particular definition of point sources many times today. So if you take anything away, please take this definition. But let's begin with a brief reminder of what the Clean Water Act does regulate, which is point sources of pollution that discharge directly into waters of the United States. The primary way it does this, as you heard in the previous panel, is through end-of-pipe effluent limits through the NPDES permit system. And that's the National Pollution Discharge Permit System. So classic examples of point sources include the discharge of wastewater from industrial plants and of sewage from municipal treatment works. But as you can see highlighted here, the definition of a point source in the Clean Water Act specifically exempts agricultural stormwater discharges and return flows from irrigated agriculture. So why are these exempted? So the logic here, and you've heard this previously, but it's an important point, so it bears repeating. The logic is that in contrast to a point source, these are non-point sources of pollution. So pollution from dispersed activities over large areas that are not traceable to a single discrete source. So unlike point sources of pollution, which the Clean Water Act has regulated quite effectively under the NPDES permit system, non-point sources of pollution are the major source of pollution that we still have to address as a country and as a state. And we can quantify that. So this quote here, the second quotation from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, acknowledges the fact that in Minnesota, non-point sources of pollution represent 86% of the state's water pollution, to give you a sense of the scale of the issue. So what are these agricultural non-point sources of pollution? Well, I always find a diagram helpful, so here's a diagram. This diagram shows how water moves across an agricultural landscape and carries pollutants into both surface waters and groundwater. So when it rains, water moves across agricultural fields and picks up nutrients. These are primarily nitrate, ammonium, and phosphorus compounds that come from chemical fertilizer and manure application. The nutrients are applied to increase crop yields. And in a balanced system, the amount of nutrients applied is roughly matches what is taken up by the plants. However, when these nutrients are applied in excess and/or the soil is in poor health, more of the nutrients bypass the plants and leach into the groundwater. We draw from the groundwater for private wells and public water systems, and groundwater feeds into surface waters like lakes and rivers through subsurface flow, which you can see represented in the arrows on the bottom of the screen. A second way that agricultural pollutants are carried into surface waters is through agricultural tile drainage and ditches, which are also shown here in the ditch system. Agricultural drainage systems not only carry nutrients directly into streams and rivers, but have also contributed to dramatic wetland loss across the state. And I think Joy mentioned this also, but these maps, the map on the left-hand side is from 1860, the map on the right-hand side is from 1981, and they show an estimate of Minnesota wetlands based on soil analysis. So as you can see in the left-hand map circled in yellow, the black and dark gray areas indicate wetland areas, and these maps illustrate the dramatic fact that since the late 19th century in Minnesota, drainage systems have converted over 90% of marshy wetland landscapes into cropland in southern and western parts of the state. This conversion to cropland means that more agricultural non-point sources exist on the landscape, like I showed you in the previous diagram. And they also indicate the loss of wetlands' critical ecosystem function to naturally filter pollutants before they reach groundwater and downstream lakes, rivers, and streams. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but these are maps from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources that show non-point health scores for the state. The left map shows how much impervious surface exists near riparian areas. So think urban development, suburban development, and to some extent agricultural development also, places where rainwater is carried quickly into surface waters and doesn't have a chance to leach into the groundwater. The map in the middle shows lands that receive nutrient application for crop production. And the map on the right-hand side is the non-point source health scores for the state calculated from the two previous data sets. The areas in red and orange are the lowest non-point source health scores, which you can see are closely correlated with areas of extensive row crop agriculture in the southern and western parts of the state. So this is going to get to the question that was asked previously about what the Clean Water Act does say to address non-point sources. So while agricultural non-point sources are exempted from the Clean Water Act permit programs, they do appear in the statute in other ways, through programs that delegate authority over non-point source management to the states. The first and most explicit of those is Section 319, which requires states to develop a non-point source management program to provide long-term programmatic direction and an overall approach for non-point source pollution. So MCEA developed our own non-point source management plan, which was first approved by the EPA in 1988, and the most recent revision was in 2013. The plan allows the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to remain eligible to receive federal funds under Section 319 and disperse those funds to local government units. So think soil and water conservation districts, watershed districts, et cetera. For those local government units to address non-point sources of pollution through small-scale watershed plans. So the focus of these 319 funds is to get the money to local government units to do small-scale work at the small watershed level. The second one is less explicit and was covered in the previous panel, but Section 303D of the Clean Water Act is the one that requires states to monitor water bodies and list impaired waters that do not meet one or more water quality standards, which can be because of a combination of point sources and non-point sources, that a water body no longer meets its water quality standards. So under this regulation, the pollution control agencies, as Joy told us already, monitors our waters and reports impaired waters to the EPA. So what is the scale of the problem of impaired waters? Well, this map lists, on this map, which is our most recent list of impaired waters, red is bad. And just this year, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency added 392 water bodies to the Section 303D list, or the impaired waters list, which brought the total to nearly 3,000 that have been listed since 1992. And as a point of contrast, only 184 waters have been removed from the list. Under Section 303, as you've already heard, the states must develop a total maximum daily load for their impaired waters. You can think of this TMDL, I am going to use the acronym, as a pollution budget that limits the amount of pollutants that can be added to a particular water body. As you know, for point sources of pollution like wastewater treatment plants, these TMDLs can be used to actually lower the amount of pollution in the effluent limits for point sources. But while TMDLs can set targets for the reduction of non-point sources, it does not have the same direct authority to compel private landowners. So remember, we're often talking about private landowners as opposed to municipal sewage treatment works or industrial plants. It doesn't have the same authority to compel private landowners to take the prescribed actions that it does for point sources. An example of best management practices that could be in an implementation plan for a TMDL, to give you a sense of what those tools are things like conservation tillage to improve soil health, riparian buffers to help filter pollutants before they reach waterways, and perennial crops to increase the crop cover so that there's better filtration. Another point that I want to add to the discussion we had in the previous panel of TMDLs and implementation plans is there's sort of a trickle-down effect. So you have a TMDL, and if there is an implementation plan that happens for the TMDL, the first place that happens is in our state is at the Huck 8 watershed level, which is at a much broader watershed level. And we have 80 Huck 8 watersheds in the state. But in our watershed management framework, the last step is for the Huck 8 watershed plan to inform the development of local plans at a local watershed scale under one watershed, one plan. And so, you know, the actual implementation of these BMPs often falls to municipal governments under one watershed, one plan, which can lead to inconsistent results. It's also slow for that trickle-down effect to happen. So we've had, in Minnesota, we've had approximately 200 TMDLs that have been approved by the EPA. We have done 77 out of 80 watershed plans at that broader watershed level, but we've only done about 30, we've only completed and approved about 30 local watershed plans under one watershed, one plan. And there's a quote here from a 2013 national survey of TMDLs from the Government Accountability Office, where it says state officials knowledgeable about TMDLs reported that 83% have achieved their targets for point source pollution. So we know this is what the Clean Water Act does well. However, only 20% have achieved their targets for non-point source pollution. So in Minnesota, there have been an array of new state strategies for non-point source pollution since 2014. But ultimately, these non-point source strategies operate on long time scales, rely on voluntary best management practice adoption by private landowners, and do not have the enforcement power of the permit programs under the Clean Water Act. I'd like to look at one example of these new state strategies in more detail to look at what the effectiveness has been. And that is the nutrient reduction strategy, which was written by the Pollution Control Agency in 2014. This is a state-level nutrient reduction strategy with 10 and 20-year numeric reduction milestones for nitrogen and phosphorus. You can see some of those milestones in the table here. So in order to reach these numeric goals, the strategy lays out approaches for both point and non-point sources of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution specifically. To address point sources of phosphorus, one of the key strategies is the review of the phosphorus effluent limits in NPDES permits for wastewater facilities to see if they comply with the recently passed statewide lake and river eutrophication standards. In part because the MCEA, the Pollution Control Agency, has not yet passed Class 2 water quality standards for nitrate, which would strengthen the enforceability of statewide regulation of nitrate. The strategies for non-point nitrate sources, same old story here. Voluntary adoption of best management practices, such as cover crops, perennials and riparian zones, reduced tillage, and restored wetlands as part of drainage projects. So once again, we see a disparity between the enforceable mechanisms. In this case, a disparity between phosphorus and nitrogen, with more point source controls for effluent, phosphorus effluent limits, and a much more reliance on voluntary best management practices for nitrate. So how has it gone? On this map, green is good, phosphorus, red is bad, nitrate. So the Pollution Control Agency recently published a 5-year progress report on this nutrient reduction strategy, which found that the strategy has seen much more success with phosphorus reductions that have enforceable controls under the Clean Water Act. The 5-year progress report shows that, so you see in the map that the map on the left-hand side is phosphorus concentration load trends over the past 10 years, and the green arrow means significant decrease. And the map on the right-hand side is nitrate concentration trends over the past 10 years, and the red arrow means a significant increase. So and I want to remind you here that the non-point sources of nitrate are largely from row crop agriculture. So the progress report actually explicitly identifies row crop agriculture as the largest source of nitrogen over time in this five-year progress report. So agencies point to these plans, and there's a list of a number of them in the previous slide. Agencies point to these plans as progress towards the goal to reduce non-point sources of pollution, and they are important strategies in terms of how we can better manage the land to protect our water bodies. But the longer-term data we've begun to collect show that non-point sources of pollutants, such as nitrate, have only increased in our state since the Clean Water Act was passed. In contrast, the pollutants we have seen dramatic reductions in are the point sources that have regulatory mechanisms in place under the Clean Water Act to address them. Phosphorus is a good example. Wastewater discharges, one of the largest sources of phosphorus loads in our state, have decreased by over 70% in the past 20 years, in large part because wastewater treatment plants are subject to those discharge limits under the NIPD's permit system. So to conclude here, I just want to emphasize the fact that our current state approaches for agricultural non-point sources of pollution have not met our state's water quality goals. In fact, despite the investment of millions of dollars in best management practices, the impacts of non-point sources are serious and continue to grow. I want to briefly mention two of those impacts. The first connects to public health. So nitrate groundwater contamination is a serious public health concern that affects both public water systems and private wells. The Minnesota Department of Agriculture from 2013 to 2017 tested a selection of private wells in areas vulnerable to groundwater contamination and found that 10% of those that they tested have nitrate levels above the human health limit for drinking water of 10 micrograms per liter. Those areas are shown in dark red in the map on the left-hand side that are over the human health limit. And this can lead, drinking water above that level can lead to a fatal condition in infants called blue baby syndrome, as well as a range of other serious health concerns. The second impact I want to briefly mention here is to aquatic life. So nitrogen and phosphorus accumulation can cause algal blooms, water degradation, and fish kills. And Lewiston and Winona County in southeastern Minnesota have had 5 fish kills in the last 6 years. The most recent one this past July killed 2,500 fish approximately in Rush Creek. So these impacts on both public health and aquatic life show how important it is that we find more effective ways to address non-point sources of pollution, specifically agricultural pollution here in Minnesota. A big part of the problem is that we don't have the same statutory authority under the Clean Water Act for the EPA to compel states to develop adequate non-point source control measures. We do have models of success to follow from urban stormwater regulation. So this was mentioned in the past panel, but urban stormwater was traditionally considered a non-point source of pollution that was added in those 1987 amendments to the Clean Water Act and is now subject to permit controls from certain types of places, certain types of urban stormwater. And as row crop agriculture has gotten more and more industrial and mechanized, people have started to ask for more stringent regulation of this industry as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Anne, who is going to talk about an area of ag that is regulated as a point source.
But not very effectively. Sorry, I blew the punchline. Okay, my name's Ann Cohn. I'm a senior staff attorney. Can you hear me? Sorry, I'm a little short when I sit down. I don't always do well with mics. I'm a senior staff attorney at MCEA. I primarily work on mining now, but in a past life, I worked extensively with the MCEA's feedlot program, and I got to experience CAFO regulation in real time. So the first question we have to ask is, how can anything so cute? All right, let's start at the beginning. Oh, there we go. Sorry. Yeah, thank you. Anyway, let's start at the beginning with what is a CAFO. Welcome to Acronymville, Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation, CAFO. So the basis of CAFO is AFO, which stands for animal feeding operation, and it's actually a defined term under federal rule. And you remember that these are point sources under the Clean Water Act. So my talk today, by the way, I'm going to talk a little bit about CAFO regulation, and then I'm going to pivot into some of the major litigation that has affected CAFO regulation. I'm going to talk about some current legal strategies for how we address the problems with CAFO regulation. And finally, because I'm a creature of state law, I'm going to touch a little bit on the state of the state regulation. We are a delegated state here in Minnesota. It's important to remember. So most of this federal law is actually implemented through state law. So anybody who's practicing in this area, remember you're going to have to be looking at state law. Anyway, back to what is a CAFO. It's defined. Part of the definition is fairly objective, 45 days of animals or more in a 12-month period. But the second part of the definition, as you can see, is rather more subjective. Crops, vegetation, etc., are not sustained in the normal growing season over any portion of the lot or facility. So, of course, a couple of questions come up here. First, I feel like my mic has stopped again. Oh, great, there it comes back. A couple of questions here. You can see in the corner of my slide an illustration of a very typical CAFO. It's black dirt, 100% black dirt. No problem there, right? It's a CAFO. There's no vegetation being sustained. But what if there was a little vegetation? Is it still a CAFO? The law is pretty ambiguous, and I will say that EPA has tried to change it a couple times, but they failed because every time they try to come up with a new definition, they get attacked by everybody. And so we've been left with this law. I had a case about a winter feedlot. As you can appreciate, a feedlot in the normal growing season, that's easy to regulate. But what happens in the winter if somebody brings a lot of cattle on their land? I had a case about that. CAFOs come in sizes, large, medium, etc., and some requirements are particular to animal type, ducks even. So if you want to know how ducks are being regulated as a CAFO, you have to go look at the regulations. The primary way that CAFOs are regulated under the Clean Water Act is that they are required to have what is called nicely a nutrient management plan. Here in Minnesota, we're a little more earthy, and we call it what it is, which is a manure management plan. So the basic regulation is that if you have one of these, you get that all-important and has been talked about quite a bit already today, agricultural stormwater exemption. And I should mention that there's two parts to most CAFOs. They have a production area, that's where the animals live, and that's where generally the manure is stored in anticipation of it being used as fertilizer on fields. And then you have what's called the land application sites. That's where you take the manure and you disperse it, so hopefully it will be utilized by the plants. But if it isn't done exactly right, of course, we know it runs off into our groundwater and our surface waters. So what is a nutrient management plan? Well, it's all based on these best management practices that you've heard about already. And best management practices are intended to and are tailored to individual facilities. So they are not written in a prescriptive manner. They are rather general concepts, and they make a lot of sense, right? Store your manure. Properly manage your mortalities, ensure clean water is diverted, etc., etc. The heart of it is probably to make sure that when you're land applying this manure or nutrient, you're applying it at appropriate agricultural levels. In other words, the plants are going to utilize it. Makes perfect sense, but as you can appreciate, it's an enforcement problem because everybody's plan is going to be different. And so you're going to have to look at a lot of different plans. So indeed, when EPA adopted these regulations, they were eventually subject to challenges. So one of the first challenges came from environmental organizations, Waterkeeper Alliance. And Waterkeeper Alliance was concerned because the beating heart of this CAFO regulation is that you have to have an adequate nutrient management plan, right? I mean, nobody, and this will come up later, I mean, nobody expects to discharge from their manure lagoons or their animal storage, their animal housing areas. That would happen only in, a bad circumstance. But every year, the risk comes from the application of the manure. And these plans were not even considered to be part of the permit. So the environmental groups won that challenge. They won that challenge. Woohoo! They got the nutrient management plans to be considered part of the permit, and they have to be published at the time the permit is proposed to be issued. So that was a rare victory. And they lost a little bit because they were arguing about groundwater in this case, and that EPA should be looking at the groundwater, and they lost that. But I query, now that Maui has come along and we have the functional equivalent standard where you can require Clean Water Act conditions related to groundwater discharges that are the functional equivalent of a direct discharge to surface water, maybe they should get a second look in at least some cases. So the industry also didn't like EPA's regulations, and eventually this bubbled up as challenges. And the main thrust of the industry challenge was that CAFOs, the production areas, they are never supposed to discharge, right? They're storing the manure, they're not discharging. So why do we have to get a discharge permit when we're not discharging? And they won that case. So EPA had tried to regulate CAFOs on the basis of their size, and the court said no. If they're not discharging, you don't get to be preemptive, you don't get to be proactive. The only way you can issue a permit to a CAFO is if it thinks it's going to be discharging, and of course they don't think they're going to be discharging, so why should they come in and get a permit? So the upshot of this litigation, which went on for a while, was CAFOs are not required to get a permit based solely on size, and not only that, but they can't be penalized for discharging without a permit. You might be able to penalize them for the discharge, but not for doing it without a permit. Anyway, so that's, EPA got a little beat up, shall we say, in the early days of CAFO regulation. So the result is the one we've heard about already today. We have not seen a lot of success in regulating agricultural related pollutants, including from CAFOs. And here, even in 2008, the Government Accountability Office was noting that the growth of the CAFO industry was creating so much manure that there was question about whether it could even adequately be spread on agricultural land. It costs, obviously, to transport manure, and so you have to really find land that's near your operation, the point of generation. And, in many counties, apparently insufficient cropland exists in a reasonable distance from where the manure is being generated. So if you don't mind me briefly popping into the state of the state, I think this is probably not dissimilar to what's going on nationally. I find this a very interesting graph. As you can see, the number of CAFOs of beef, dairy, and poultry have stayed relatively constant, but there has been a big increase in one particular part of this industry, swine. So that cute little piggy. There's a lot more of them. And you can see where they located. Well, not surprisingly, in the central south area of the state, Iowa, close to the Iowa border. Iowa has a lot of hog feedlots. And where is there excess nitrate in the surface waters? Well, no surprise, there it is. So what are the environmental interests doing about this situation? Well, in 2017, a bunch of environmental groups, including some from Minnesota, brought a rulemaking petition. Of course, this hit during the Trump administration, so nothing was done about it. The argument was the NPDES permits issued to CAFOs are failing to require water monitoring, and they exempt most chronic CAFO discharges from permit requirements through an unreasonably broad reading of the agricultural stormwater exemption. So nothing happened. until October last month. A follow-up lawsuit was filed. The Food and Water Watch, the lead organization here, is asking the Ninth Circuit to issue a writ of mandamus requiring EPA to thumbs up, thumb down on this petition so they can appeal it forward under the Administrative Procedures Act. So that's one path that's being pursued, try to get EPA to improve its regulations. A unique approach occurred in the case of Cow Palace. If the Clean Water Act isn't getting the job done, well, why don't we look somewhere else? And this case was brought under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act that governs the management of waste. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense because the main problem here with feedlots is waste, right? It's a big waste accumulation situation. So they brought this case out west again, Washington, and they won. But it seems to be a one-off. It hasn't been followed by any other cases that I can find. So I think that's probably a dead end. Another approach that's been taken recently in litigation, where there has been, again, some success, is to look at the fact that most of the CAFO permits that are being issued do not require monitoring. And so again, our friends at Food and Water Watch brought a lawsuit in 2021 that resulted in the issuance of a court order going to EPA, because EPA is the implementing agency in Idaho. And EPA was told, yeah, you got to put some monitoring in this permit. You got to monitor both the production areas and also the land application areas. Now, the plaintiffs had put in a lot of evidence. Somehow they had gathered a lot of evidence to support this case. The same is true in the Cow Palace case. Lots of evidence had been gathered showing that the CAFO was over-applying the nutrient and that problems were developing in local wells and etc. It was a heavy lift. But this approach seems to be a successful one, and in fact was recently followed in a case in our neighboring state of Wisconsin called Clean Wisconsin, Inc. versus Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and our very own Carly was involved in that case in support of the litigators, the Midwest Environmental Advocates. So yay, Carly. And the issue there, again, was whether, as it turned out, whether DNR, Wisconsin DNR, had the authority to impose off-site and on-site groundwater monitoring conditions as part of the Wisconsin NPDES permit. And the issue there was about a large CAFO dairy operation. And this went through hearing and eventually got to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And lo and behold, the Wisconsin Supreme Court said quite clearly, yeah, DNR, not only you have the authority, you should probably be using it. So that was really a very positive development, but there's always a but, isn't there? So Wisconsin DNR issued this permit to the facility, which is called Kennard's Dairy. And now that particular permit is now being subject to challenge by Kennard's, and it's back to hearing and through the courts again. So fighting hard. But anyway, that seems to be a path forward here with regard to improving regulation of CAFOs. Back to the state. State and state regulations. We are in a delegated state. There's a chapter of state rules devoted to CAFO regulation. It is very different from the way the federal rules are laid out. It's Minnesota Rules Chapter 7020. And we have state statutes in that govern CAFOs. So those are mostly found in 116.07. And they're directed toward the MCEA, which of course is the implementing agency. So of note, we in Minnesota do not exempt non-dischargers from the state permit requirement. We do still regulate proactively, preventatively based on size. So if you're a large CAFO or you meet some other characteristics, you do have to get a state permit regardless of whether you have to get a federal permit. And there is no exemption for agricultural stormwater discharges, except I got to put a pin on that and say sort of. State rules, though, still are not explicit in requiring monitoring of surface and underground waters at production sites or the manure application sites. So there's no explicit requirement, although I'm aware that some agency permits do contain monitoring based on specific facility conditions. So could the MPCA require monitoring? Could they change the CAFO permits and put monitoring requirements in them? Well, they'd have to get over a few speed bumps. And here we go with the state law. And may I tell you that these are just a sampling of the speed bumps that exist out there for regulation of CAFOs. There are far, far more speed bumps when it comes to regulation of CAFOs, only you don't want to see me cry, so I'm just going to stick with these. Anyway, the first one is that the agency may not impose additional conditions as part of a feedlot permit. So if you're going to go beyond what the rules say, you got to have the feedlot operator agree to the additional conditions, or maybe the agency tries to make an argument, we're not going to issue the permit at all. So query, what's the point of a permit if the only thing that can go in there is what's required with regard to rule? And I have to say my experience has been the agency has been relatively successful in issuing permits with conditions where necessary. So we have had some, this hasn't been a huge impediment. Item O here is a discharge of land applied manure that is managed according to agency rule must not be subject to a fine for a discharge violation. So there you go. It's sort of like the agricultural stormwater exemption, except maybe even worse. I'm not sure. For the purposes of feedlot permitting, item P, and this I have to say is a very Delphic. You guys know what Delphic means? It's kind of like it's unclear, right? You know, when the oracle spoke, it never spoke clearly, and this statute is like that because it says, essentially, it seems to be saying that a discharge is not a discharge unless it is a discharge into the waters of the state. So you can see there was a lot of fighting going on at the legislature when this went down. Another issue that MCEA has been very concerned about is the agronomic rate. Now, where does agronomic rate come from? Right? This is supposed to be the amount of nutrient that the plant can actually remove from the manure that's being land spread on the fields. And if you have excess manure, right, where does it go? It goes into groundwater and surface water. Where does that come from? It comes from the University of Minnesota Extension Service, which was very surprised to learn that it has a big regulatory role. And we've been having very, I have to say, and this is in all honesty, very helpful and productive discussions with the agencies and the university to talk about this. So the problem that MCEA saw was that cost of fertilizer has crept into this calculation. So the recommendation is you apply more if it's cheap and you apply less if it's expensive. And of course, manure is cheap. So there's the rub, right? So if you're using manure to supply the nutrients, you can always apply more. And anyway, this is the very beginning of a long conversation about how we manage this. So I'm not going to talk about this, but there is commercial fertilizer rules as well. And, you know, basically the bottom line here is a couple things. CAFOs are difficult to regulate under the Clean Water Act because they are very different from typical point sources that discharge continuously. The nutrient management plan is very difficult to police. And CAFOs are protected by a lot of exemptions and exceptions in state and federal law, but recent litigation has shown some promise of getting some improvements. And thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to try to answer your questions.
Okay, so I'm Stephanie Fitzgerald. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Clean Water Act and how it interacts or doesn't interact with agricultural drainage.
I've been told when practicing this that the term ag drainage is less than inspiring. So try to think of it like we've heard, multiple people talk about how big of an issue agricultural pollution is. So think of drainage as the delivery system of that pollution to our waters, and that maybe it's more exciting. So to clarify what I mean when I say ag drainage, I'm referring to like a spider webbing. Well, maybe I can give you a slide here. A spider webbing of tile and pipe underground and then above ground ditches as well that takes water from cropland into our streams and then rivers. And the purpose of the systems is to dry out the lands, like you see here, some wet cropland, and make it more productive for crop growth. And then I've got a little kind of dissection picture there of what drainage tile looks like. So, of course, drainage tile isn't just taking water off the land, it's also taking nutrients with it. Under pre-drained conditions, water would sit on the land and filter through, filter out some of those pollutants before it ended up, into our water system. And so when you add drainage into the picture, more pollutants end up in our water. And pollution isn't the only environmental impact we're concerned about with drainage. It's also, downstream flooding is a big issue. More water rushed into streams and rivers means that flood events can cause a lot more erosion and property damage than in pre-drained conditions. A little bit of context too, before I get too far into this, is that a lot of the drainage systems, tile and whatnot in Minnesota, these systems, a lot of them were built 100 years ago in the early 1900s. So they're deteriorating, failing, not doing their job. So that means a lot of Minnesota property owners that use the systems are seeking to repair them or improve them, and that can trigger legal implications that I will talk about. So another slide here just of the Minnesota River meeting the Mississippi. I'm sure many of you have already seen this picture. So the Clean Water Act. As you've heard from the previous speakers, the Clean Water Act is focused on regulating point sources, and agricultural stormwater is specifically excluded as a point source. So historically, the Clean Water Act hasn't really been used to restrict agricultural drainage via permits. However, there are a couple federal cases that call that assumption into question. So what I'm going to cover is two federal cases that question, could agricultural drainage be a point source? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how Minnesota law comes into play where the Clean Water Act doesn't, and discuss a few state cases. Okay, so the first case I want to talk about is the Des Moines Waterworks case, and Des Moines Waterworks is a water utility. So they provide drinking water to central Iowa. In this case, they're the plaintiffs, and they sue 13 upstream drainage districts in federal court, saying these drainage districts are discharging pollutants without a permit. So I'm going to pause here and try to give you a picture of what I mean when I say drainage districts. At the turn of the century, the Iowa legislature passed a law that allowed landowners to come together and form drainage districts for the purpose of managing their drainage together. And the counties in Iowa play like an administrator role for those districts. So it sounds kind of similar to watershed districts in Minnesota, but they're actually, a drainage district in Iowa is more akin to a single drainage ditch system in Minnesota. So there are a lot of them, and they're not as big as like watershed districts here. So I think there are over 3,700 drainage districts in Iowa. So back to the case. This plaintiff utility is trying to recover money because they're getting water that is polluted with nitrates, and they need to provide clean drinking water to central Iowa. So they're spending a lot of money cleaning the water up, and they want paid back, essentially. So they sue the drainage districts and say, you know what, actually, these are point sources. They don't fall within the exemption for agricultural stormwater. They say agricultural stormwater means runoff. It means surface runoff. But here, what the drainage districts are putting into our streams and rivers is more accurately characterized as groundwater being flushed out by drainage tile rather than surface runoff. So, what's the answer here? Well, we don't have an answer because the federal court kicks them out of court on technical grounds. The court says these drainage districts are not proper defendants because they don't have the power to redress the harm. So the harm is the pollution, and because of the nature of their drainage districts and what their enabling legislation looks like, they really don't have any power to regulate pollution. And so, what are they going to do to fix the problem? So after a few years of litigation, no answer to the question of could these be point sources. For our purposes in Minnesota, the question is whether a different defendant would produce a different result, particularly because the drainage statutes in Minnesota actually do give drainage authorities some power to consider environmental factors. They direct them to consider environmental factors when making drainage decisions. So that's kind of a TBD. Okay. So going back to our Clean Water Act ag exemptions, we've been talking a lot about stormwater, but if you look here at this highlighted language here, it's kind of like a double exemption. It talks about stormwater discharges, but it also says return flows from irrigated agriculture is exempt. And so the idea behind having both of these things exempted is that dry land that needs irrigation and then cropland that uses rainfall for irrigation are treated the same under the Clean Water Act. So that's the idea of having that return flows from irrigated agriculture in the exemption. So now I'm going to talk about a federal case that is kind of similar but deals with the irrigated ag side of things. And this is the Pacific Coast case. Okay, so this is a picture of a drainage system we're going to talk about in California. So Pacific Coast case is a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals case where various plaintiffs get together and sue the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and the San Luis and Delta Mendota Water Authority. And they allege that this drainage system that's managed by the defendants is violating the Clean Water Act by discharging without a permit. So the big picture here is that in California, there's this huge drainage project, the Central Valley Project, and it takes a bunch of water from the river, Sacramento River, San Joaquin River, and uses it to irrigate cropland, and then it takes the water back to the river. So the question is whether the water that goes back into the rivers is composed entirely of return flows. I'm going to go backwards to let you see that language again and note the specific language. Discharge is composed entirely of return flows. Okay, so the plaintiffs argue this discharge isn't actually exempted because some of the water mixed in there is actually coming from under a solar project near the cropland, not from the cropland. The court addresses a few issues. I'm going to just focus on two of them. The court says the term irrigated agriculture should be construed broadly to include discharges from all activities related to crop production. But, and most importantly, the court significantly narrows the irrigated agriculture exemption by reading the word entirely to be literal. The court says the exemption only applies when the discharge is wholly composed of discharges related to crop production. So if there's water mixed in from non-crop activities, it's not going to fall within the exemption. So it sends it back to the district court. Years of motion practice ensue, also to be determined what's going to happen there. So this leaves open some really big questions, particularly one question for me at least is it's a little odd because in the exemption language there you see this term does not include return flows from irrigated agriculture. That part doesn't have the entirely language, but then the NIPD's permit exemption does. So we'll see what happens. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about, just for a couple minutes, about Minnesota and how, drainage activities do trigger Minnesota laws, quite a few state environmental protections. And I just have 3 buckets here. There are others, but these are the buckets that I'll touch on really briefly. So first is 103E, and this is actually our drainage statute. So where our laws, are compiled about drainage. And this does include environmental considerations. In the general provisions section of the code, the statute requires that drainage authorities consider various environmental factors, including water quality, erosion, downstream flooding, among other things. So that's what I was talking about when I said, well, it is a little different here in Minnesota than in Iowa. And of course, that doesn't mean that there isn't mischief and that just, drainage authorities, whether it's the county or a joint county board or the watershed district, that there isn't some mischief and they just throw out generalized findings and don't actually do any type of analysis about the environmental factors. But we know the law at least tells them to do that. Second, I've got 103G up here, and that's Minnesota's water statute. And it contains quite a few protections for public waters, including requiring certain drainage projects to get a public waters work permit from the Department of Natural Resources before doing a project that, will impact public waters. So I want to note here that Minnesota Statute 103G does give a definition of public waters. And then back in the 70s, the legislature told the Department of Natural Resources, make an inventory of the waters that meet that definition. That's just going to come into play in a second when I talk about a recent case. Okay, so third, we've got our environmental review laws. Certain drainage projects, when they impact public waters, will have to go through environmental study before they can commence. So I've got a few minutes here. I'm just going to highlight a couple of recent cases where we see agricultural drainage and Minnesota environmental laws intersect. The first one is the Limbo Creek case. So in September, the Minnesota Supreme Court handed down a decision relating to public waters and ag drainage. So in this case, the citizens group that was the plaintiff protecting public waters, represented by MCEA, raised concerns about a project, an improvement project in Renville County. When I say an improvement, I mean, as opposed to a repair where you just want to keep the system the same, an improvement is like an expansion in some way of the system. So the drainage system at issue flowed into a creek called Limbo Creek, and the proposers wanted to ditch through part of that creek to expand their system and, basically get more water off the land. So under the Minnesota Environmental Policy Act, which is our environmental review law that requires environmental study for certain projects, one of the categories that generally requires study are projects that will change the course, current, or cross-section of public waters. And the citizen group posited that this project was going to change Limbo Creek, a public water that met the statutory definition, so environmental review was required. And the county disagreed and said, actually, this water is not on the inventory, so it's not a public water. So ultimately the Supreme Court decided that under the circumstances, it was correct to require environmental review based on the statutory definition, but they stopped short of actually saying that reference to public waters without reference to the inventory would always mean that the definition controls. So that's a lot of stuff to say. We've got this definition of public waters. We've also got an inventory. Sometimes the law refers to one, sometimes it refers to the other. In this case, it referred to the definition, and so that won the day. Okay, so I'll just touch on one more. Let's see. That kind of shows you this, how following the rules, how you get to the statutory definition. Okay, the last thing I'll talk about, I'm not going to get in depth with this, but if there are any drainage practitioners, I just wanted to mention the MCEA versus Big Stone County case. Even though it's 20 years old, it's a really good sampler platter of all things drainage and environmental law in Minnesota, because it includes environmental impact statements, a repair project, a public waters work permit, a wetland classification, and a replacement. So it has everything. I won't go into the details. I'll just say this one is really interesting because it's a really rare case where a repair project where you're just trying to keep the system the same as it was originally constructed actually ended up requiring the highest level of environmental review, an environmental impact statement, and requiring a public waters work permit from DNR, because the project was going to take a protected type 5 wetland down to an unprotected type 2 wetland. So there's the site if you want to read the case. It's just a good example. And then lastly, I also have one slide with some citations of the drainage decisions that have come down in Minnesota in the last year-ish. These are mostly procedural, but if you practice drainage law, those are the ones that have come around in the last year. So that's kind of an overview of ag drainage stuff. I'm going to turn this back to Carly so she can maybe take questions.
Next question.
Okay. Oh, that was yeah, something else.
You guys are just passing notes.
Yes.
Right. So that's interesting.
All right, we have a question here. Could the state choose to regulate agricultural nitrate discharges despite the federal exemption? So I would say that the fact that the Clean Water Act authorizes states to develop water quality-based effluent limits is a good example of where the state can have regulatory power over agricultural nitrate discharges, through water quality. Because as Joy mentioned, what the water quality-based effluent limits allow you to do is consider downstream impact, right? So it's really important in the example of agricultural nitrate because so much of it is accumulation from these non-point sources that impact downstream water quality. So the full development of water quality standards, so water quality standards being the first step to develop water quality-based effluent limits, the full development of water quality standards for all designated uses of waters within the state is an important first step for the state to take. And we've done that for many waters, but not all of our designated uses.
Yeah, so if I can pop in here just to be a little more concise, yes, the state can be more stringent than the federal law. So if the state wanted to, it could adopt any number of different standards or water quality standards or laws that are more stringent, and sometimes does. But as you can appreciate politically, there are tremendous pressures arrayed against the state doing that. And you see some of that in the CAFO regulations.
I have a manure question for you, Anne. So why do land managers even want to apply manure in the fall if it doesn't accomplish anything? What alternatives do CAFOs have for disposition of manure?
I love this question because it's like deep manure. So let's talk about it. There are actually, so there is nutrient loss, right, for fall applied manure. The main reason that CAFOs want to apply the manure in the fall is that if they don't, their manure storage will overflow. So that's the main reason. There are some other reasons why it's done, including the fact that often the fields are better to work in the fall than they are in the spring when they're wet. And so to get the task of applying nutrient out of the way when the fields are more workable and won't be compacted, for very legitimate reasons, the farmers want to go in there in the fall and apply nutrient, even knowing that some of it will be lost. Anytime you want to talk about manure, I'm your gal.
Let's see, I have one here on drinking water's concern. So in 2019 at Water Day at the Capitol, a 14-year-old resident told the thousands of Minnesotans in attendance that this is a narrative question, I like this, that 6 communities in southwestern Minnesota are importing drinking water from the Missouri River because the local wells are contaminated from industrial ag or CAFOs. Why do none of the laws prevent this from happening, the operation of these polluting industries from contaminating drinking water? I think this should be a group answer. Do any of you?
Oh, I have an answer. What it boils down to, and you can accuse me of being too philosophical, what it boils down to is who bears risk. And if you were a producer, you would, and you're trying to make your land productive as possible, you don't want to have any risk of that crop failing or underperforming. So you're gonna put on more nutrient, commercial fertilizer or manure, because you don't want to accept that risk. But unfortunately, that transfers the risk to the public. So this is why this situation develops. It's all about, in my opinion, who bears the risk. And to date, it's a tragedy of the commons, or it's an externality. We've allowed the risk to be passed to the public, to the waterworks, to the people who are drinking the water to clean their own water up, because producers, quite legitimately, are afraid if they don't do what is recommended by their fertilizer salesperson or whoever, they might not have an optimal crop, and they don't want that risk. So it's a very human problem, if I can call it that.
And I would in general say there are differences in the protections for private well owners as opposed to those on municipal systems, because under the Safe Drinking Water Act, the EPA can compel public water systems to meet certain maximum contaminant load standards. And the EPA is in the process of doing this for 2 different PFAS compounds right now. But those same regulatory standards don't apply to private well owners. So there's also diffuse authority over the issue in state agencies in Minnesota. So the PCA does manure, the Department of Agriculture does chemical fertilizer. There's some public health mandates within the Department of Health. So it's also a diffuse authority problem, and the fact that there's much less regulatory protections for private well owners.
All right, I'm going to call it right there. Thank you so much to our panelists. That was great. We are going to take our break until 3:20 for our last panel, which is Hot Topics in the Clean Water Act. So stick around. All right, welcome back for our final panel today. So this final panel focuses on 3 issues that are very much top of mind for water lawyers, for regulators right now. And I'm going to just go ahead and introduce all 3 topics and then let the speakers go. So our first presentation is on a recent a case that's at the Supreme Court right now, the U.S. Supreme Court. They heard oral arguments in a Clean Water Act case involving this waters of the U.S. question, which has, been going back and forth over the years, as you saw. This is a case called Sackett versus EPA. And so here to talk about that is Mehmet Konar-Steenberg. He holds a chair in energy and environmental law right here at Mitchell Hamline and helped us arrange the venue today. So thank you, Mehmet. And he teaches in those areas as well as constitutional law, administrative law, and property law. So that's our first one. Our second one is on tribal law. So tribal governments can apply for special status under the Clean Water Act, known as treatment as a state. So we'll learn more about what that means and how it affects water regulation in Minnesota, and get an update specifically on how this has affected the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa to object to a sulfide mining proposal called Polymet based on impacts to Fond du Lac's water resources. And here to talk about that is Sarah Van Norman. She is the founder of Van Norman Law and has worked almost exclusively in Indian country. I was impressed to read in her bio that she has worked for and with over 50 federally recognized Indian tribes. And she's also a mediator and an arbitrator. And she has many talents. Our third presentation is around the pollutants commonly known as PFAS or PFOA. They're all over the news right now. You've probably seen the headlines. We'll get an update on federal and state efforts to regulate these ubiquitous forever chemicals from Jay Eidsness. He is one of our own staff attorneys at MCEA. He has worked as an associate attorney in private practice at Nichols Castor and also been a law clerk in U.S. District Court. So we're excited to have Jay with us as well. So those are our panels, and I'm just going to send it over to Mehmet. Take it away.
All right, thank you. Thanks everybody for being here today. These are the Sacketts, and they may or may not look familiar to you, but the name should be familiar to you if you practice in this area, because this is their second trip up to the United States Supreme Court. So Michael and Chantel Sackett bought a piece of property in Idaho, and this piece of property, you can kind of see it in this slide. It might be hard to distinguish, but there's a red box here. They proposed to build a home on this piece of property. And in the course of doing that, started bringing in gravel and fill to take care of the fact that they were basically building in a wetland. In the original go-around in this case, the Sacketts, they got their building permits. They started building. EPA found out about this, issued a administrative compliance order. This whole mess went up to the United States Supreme Court back in 2012 on the question of whether the Sacketts in their lawsuit against EPA had jumped the gun, whether there was yet a final agency action. Turns out the Supreme Court says there is final agency action. We'll send this back down so the district court can do its job on the merits. And the merits question is there waters of the United States at stake in this controversy? You can see again from this slide that there is a big body of water, Priest Lake, one of the largest lakes in Idaho, not too far away from the Sackett's property. Behind the Sackett's property, there's a big fen called the Kalispell Bay Fen. That fen drains by a surface connection into Priest Lake. But as far as anybody can tell, the Sackett's property itself doesn't have a surface connection to Priest Lake. Instead, water might get from the Sackett's property through subsurface diffusion. The reason it doesn't have a surface connection, sorry to keep flipping back and forth, is because it is bounded on the north by a road, bounded on the south by a road and some homes. There's just no direct surface connection to Priest Lake or any other navigable water. And so the issue in the merits case is, well, do they need a Clean Water Act permit? Is this a situation where there's a attempt to fill a water of the United States or not? And the way that we're going to end up sort of framing the issues here is which of the opinions from the Rapanos case, which you discussed earlier today, is going to win. Is Justice Scalia's formulation of the way we should think about these issues going to predominate? Is Justice Kennedy's formulation going to predominate, or is something else going to predominate? So here's what's happening currently. The district court on the merits ruled that the property does contain waters of the United States based on Justice Kennedy's nexus test, significant nexus test. The Sackett's appealed to the Ninth Circuit, and in the meantime, the EPA withdrew its compliance order and stated in writing that EPA does not intend to issue another compliance order against the Sackett's, which then prompted a mootness kind of analysis. The Ninth Circuit decides no, despite the withdrawal of that order, this is not moot. And we, like the district court, think that Justice Kennedy's significant nexus test is the law. We think that's what we're supposed to be doing, says the Ninth Circuit. And applying that test here, that the Sackett's property is adjacent to a tributary, a traditional tributary that eventually works its way into Priest Lake. And there's also the not insignificant fact that we know that water is moving from this property into Priest Lake through the berm. Despite the existence of berms around the property, it's still moving into the lake. Okay. So just as a reminder here, these are the opinions, the competing rules, if you will, from the Rapanos case. And the district court in the Ninth Circuit hew to Justice Kennedy's significant nexus test, which, as you know from the earlier presentation, emphasizes this notion that jurisdiction over wetlands depends on the existence of the significant nexus to a navigable water. And by significant nexus, Justice Kennedy's test really seems to be focusing on a nexus that is informed by the purposes of the Clean Water Act. The purposes of the Clean Water Act being to preserve the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of covered waters. So it's not a bright line test, obviously. It's a test that requires some technical judgment to implement. Justice Scalia's test, which I've described here as a brighter line test, was based on the notion of observation, really. Can a property owner or the government discern a continuous surface connection between a wetland and one of these permanent waters? So this particular case has been cast as sort of a debate between these two potential rules. And certainly the Sackett's have gone to the Supreme Court and said, we think you should adopt Justice Kennedy's formulation here. EPA has defended, saying we think we should stick with the Kennedy approach. But there might be reasons to think that the court is looking for another rule, maybe a middle position if one exists. One of the reasons I say that is this interesting little wrinkle. The Sackett's, in their petition for certiorari, characterized the question presented as should Rapanos be revisited to adopt the Scalia pluralities test. That's how they would have had the Supreme Court frame the issue. And the Supreme Court declined to frame it that way. The Supreme Court instead framed it as whether the Ninth Circuit set forth the proper test. Remember, the Ninth Circuit used Justice Kennedy's formulation. This might be, too much, law professor navel gazing and so forth, or how many angels dance on the head of a pin. But in formulating the rule, or rather the issue statement this way, the Supreme Court obviously is leaving its options open, right? By asking, did the Ninth Circuit set forth the proper test? It's really inviting sort of a debate about what should be the proper test. Not should it be Justice Scalia's test or Justice Kennedy's test, but a kind of a broader question as to what should be the test. Also, at the oral argument, there was discussion about, is there some middle ground? Justice Kagan asked a question to the Sackett's attorney saying, is there some middle position here that we could adopt? And initially, the Sackett's attorney responded by saying, well, maybe we should draw a distinction between wetlands that are separated from navigable waters by natural barriers versus those that are separated by man-made barriers. And then having said that, he kind of realized what he had said and maybe didn't want us. He started backpedaling almost right away. But again, one can imagine sort of more nuanced rules that might strike some kind of middle ground. Well, again, the Sacketts are not pushing for a middle ground. The Sacketts are saying, let's do what Justice Scalia said. And they have their own sort of version of what that looks like, but it really does come down to this question of, do we have this continuous surface water connection? And their reason for sort of pushing this rule is they think the value that's being sacrificed by the Kennedy approach is maybe what we might call predictability. They're taking this from the perspective of a landowner and saying, how is a landowner supposed to know when they buy a piece of property whether they're going to need a Clean Water Act permit or not? Justice Scalia's rule at least makes it more plausible or easier for a landowner to look at the property and say, oh yeah, we're going to need a permit, or no, there's no continuous surface connection here, we're fine. They're elevating that value maybe above all other values here. EPA obviously in advocating Justice Kennedy's approach talks about the problems with Justice Scalia's approach. They say that Justice Scalia continuous surface water approach can lead to all kinds of weird results. A small surface connection that's visible, that would suffice, but the presence of a berm would defeat coverage despite a pervasive hydrological connection. And does that make sense? Does it make sense to have that very formalistic approach based on what we can observe versus what the hydrological realities might be? My time's running out. So just very briefly, I will mention a further wrinkle to all this, which is this litigation is happening at the same time that EPA is about to potentially set forth yet another rule on what are the waters of the United States. In the Biden administration's regulatory agenda, EPA announced that it would be working on another rule to replace the current rule, and is engaging in all kinds of discussions with stakeholders to figure out what the content of that rule should be. Maybe another reason why the Supreme Court maybe either holds off on issuing an opinion, maybe, or at least takes the perspective that some of the justices, including Justice Kavanaugh, have enunciated, which is to the extent that the current rule and our interpretation, the Supreme Court's interpretation of it is problematic, maybe that's something Congress would want to fix, but we should not continue to be changing the rule and then changing the rule again, changing the rule again. That shouldn't be the role of the court. That can be up to the administration. That can be up to Congress. So now we're waiting to know what happens, right? We had the oral arguments, and we will wait to see what kind of decision comes down and whether it's colored at all by what the administration does in the adoption of its new rule. So a lot of things up in the air, as kind of seems to be the case with this Waters of the United States thing for a very long time. So kind of, in that sense, nothing has changed. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Mehmet. Again, I'm Sarah Van Norman, and I'm unlike these folks. I am a private attorney, and I work for tribes primarily, and I've been doing that for couple of decades now, which is hard to believe. But here I am. I was taking notes, Mehmet, during your talk, and they're just not free association, but association words between what you're talking about and what I'm talking about. Even though they're different contexts, nothing's really different. One note was change of administration means everything. That's directly affected the specific cases I'm going to be speaking about, just the same as it certainly has affected the Sackett's case. Waiting, ... is another note I've taken. We're currently waiting now into, 6 months for an important decision from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in connection with the PolyMet lines of cases, multiple lines, multiple cases, multiple jurisdictions. I also wrote a $sign. The Sacketts have deep pockets behind them if they've gone up to the Supreme Court twice. And that $sign is also something that matters when I'm looking at cases, because tribes, as environmental players, I mean, in the litigation sense, in the legal sense, you see that evolving in the last couple of decades, really no more than about 30 years, 40 years at the very outside, because that's when you start to see tribes have more substantial economic resources to fight these fights, to fight certain treaty rights cases that at their heart are water cases, at their heart are natural resource cases. And the last thing I wrote was water flows. That's what it does. All of the ways we slice it, all of the divisions jurisdictionally we make, who's got it, who doesn't, whether this is a water of the United States because there is somebody kicked up a berm of dirt, or that berm of dirt was left as a glacial deposit. This isn't reality. That's not science. That's pure law. Water flows. And that's what's underpinning so many of the decisions that tribes in environmental cases are, in Clean Water Act cases, and in state parallel cases you're seeing more and more that tribes are bringing. That's really the heart of it, and what people return to, that obvious understanding. Right now, one of the courts, I would say it's kind of a crucible. Like, there's so many things that are coming out of PolyMet related permitting processes. There are multiple processes. This mine I was looking at some materials of mine. I'm talking about a case that I'm not on today, but I certainly handle, and it's very public that I've handled a number of other water-related cases for Fond du Lac, and I'll talk a little bit about those. But I was specifically asked to talk about this one. So I talked to the legal team for this particular PolyMet-related case, and in doing so realized, I did work on that. It's 10 years ago now, because PolyMet never dies, is the moral of the story so far. It's been around, it's taken some hits, it's had some wins, but I think that, I'm crossing my fingers. I have a strong bias against the permits ever finalizing and this mine ever being built. Why is that? Okay, well, PolyMet is a proposed copper, nickel, platinum, fill in the blank, additional things, I'm sure, mine that is proposed at a site that's located 70 miles upstream from the Fond du Lac Bands Reservation. What's a reservation? It's the only homeland you got. There's not going to be more reservation land for Fond du Lac. It is where they have the quasi-sovereign authority that tribes have under the law. It is irreplaceable. And they've done an enormous amount of work on reservation to restore the health of wild rice waters, to deal with the enormous agricultural ditching system that had diminished those in other waters on reservation. I missed some of the earlier talks, but I'm sure that was coming in as well. And many other things to really invest in the health of on-reservation waters. But Like I said at the beginning, and this is no surprise to anyone here, water flows. There's no such thing as a demarcated reservation line when it comes to natural resources. So what happens off reservation is always going to affect what happens on reservation for every purpose. And so this proposed mine, that's been hanging out there for ages and going through every level and bouncing around back and forth for additional review, has always been, frankly, terrifying, because a failure of the tailings basin or any number of other aspects of initial construction of this proposed mine will almost without exception, experts agree, have the potential to decimate downstream water resources. The specific things that EPA even agreed, now that there is a different administration, would indeed be at huge risk just from the initial construction, include a huge release of mercury and consequent effects of mercury releases include, I don't need to get into for this crowd, the potential health effects for people and for aquatic life and for everything. But it has particular impacts on wild rice that's particularly well studied in this state. Otherwise, there's profound impacts on specific conductance, which is another way of talking about how much, let me get this wrong, somebody in this room can correct me, but how much is in the water, how much particulate, how much charge it can hold, basically, and correspondingly, it's a measure of the health of the water. How'd I do? Okay, all right. And the EPA agreed there are no corrective actions in these proposed permits. And particularly, they were talking about the Clean Water Act Section 404 permit, which is the dredge and fill permit that the Corps issues, but has to do with input from EPA and others. EPA recommends the Corps not reinstate what was then a suspended Clean Water Act Section 404 permit for this project as currently proposed. In other words, there's no way that they can build this project and deal with those problems at least under current science and common sense. That simple set of statements is the culmination of a huge amount of effort by some organizations in this room and particularly by the Fond du Lac Band, investing its own resources in fighting in administrative forums, in fighting in federal court, federal and state administrative proceedings, because of the existential threat that this mine poses. The other thing to keep in mind is this mine and a number of other large off-reservation projects are in Minnesota are in one or another of the ceded territories. Ceded territories are really, they encompass oftentimes a reservation set aside or holdback reserved land, but they are a much larger area where a tribe continues even after execution of a treaty and creation, recognition of a reservation, continues to have off-reservation hunting, fishing, gathering rights. There's slightly different dimensions in different places. Some treaties don't contain any such language reserving those rights. Here we have a very robust, as far as it goes, treaty. It's really just about a sentence, but that's everything when it comes to these issues in the 1854 treaty. And we have co-management of treaty resources in basically the entire Arrowhead region of Minnesota. There are some fights that have yet to be fought around who does what, where, when, but there is co-management as between the state and the tribes who have rights under that treaty for those purposes. Those tribes include the Bois Forte Band, Grand Portage, and Fond du Lac. Those three and the state of Minnesota do certain things off reservation together. This mine, Polymet, lies within the 1854 ceded territory. Can the tribe file a lawsuit on that basis alone? No. You have to proceed under state law or federal law and use what you can, at least in our current legal moment, because those, what we call usufructuary rights, are complicated. And there's, we have to choose, going back to that dollar sign I wrote down, when and how we tee up certain fights. So the bottom line being, Fond du Lac was faced several years ago with the decision of how to invest its resources. Where was it going to do that? This is only one of the fights that it's fighting right now. There's other off-reservation resources, or excuse me, proposed projects that Fond du Lac and other tribes are addressing as best they can. Sometimes they have to do it on a permit by permit basis, which is an extraordinary burden. And sometimes there are moments where you can take another cut. I'm working on a project for Fond du Lac right now, representing Fond du Lac and Grand Portage, appealing to the federal court EPA Region 5's approval of MPCA's Class 3 and 4 water quality standards changes to industrial and agricultural water quality standards because, they're arguing that it lacked evidence, that there was lack of substantial evidence to justify the particular changes made, as well as overwhelming evidence the contrary, suggesting that those standards would not be protective of water in Minnesota. So that's another investment that those tribes are making, along with some allies on the environmental side. So those are some of the kind of current, that's a small selection of the current fights that Minnesota tribes are engaged in. Fond du Lac particularly, would anybody care to guess what the Corps has done in light of EPA's and Fond du Lac's extensive record and information, and that in May, that hearing where EPA said, hey, you can't make this permit work, it shouldn't be issued. Anyone care to guess what Corps has done? Absolutely nothing. We are all still waiting. That's just the waiting part.
You were supposed to call on somebody. It's a
I
lawsuit.
could have. Well, I would have called on Rick because I can see him right over there and I know he knows stuff. And if he doesn't, he'll make it up for us. So I think that's about my time. I just wanted to give folks kind of a slice of what's happening out there. Fond du Lac isn't the only tribe in Minnesota who's really pushing and trying to protect their water through a combination of informal contacts. We have a number of different things happening in state-tribal relationships in this state that have been pretty positive, even if we're also suing each other on occasion. So there's lobbying, there's informal meetings, a lot of staff-to-staff contacts, a lot of work going on between tribes and our EPA region. And all of it is a reflection of a huge investment of time and resources in protection of water at the topmost level. I was honored to be able to talk about it. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Mehmet. And thanks to everybody for being here today and for sticking with us today. I have the great honor of wrapping up today's CLE. My name is Jay Eidsness. I'm a staff attorney at MCEA. I've been at the center since 2020. And in the 2+ years that I've been with MCEA, I've really immersed myself in another great public health crisis that seems to be on everyone's lips today, the fight against PFAS. So I hope to introduce PFAS to everybody, kind of set some ground rules for what we're talking about when we refer to PFAS. I want to talk a little bit about why this family of chemicals is problematic. And then, because this is a CLE on the Clean Water Act, look at the Clean Water Act to see if there are ways and tools that the EPA can leverage to fight this fight against PFAS. And then I will also just conclude with looking at a few other legal mechanisms that have been used and can be used to try to clean up these contaminants from our water. So what are PFAS? I will try to avoid speaking in a lot of acronyms, but PFAS is an acronym in and of itself. It stands for per or polyfluorinated alkali substances, polyfluoroalkyl substances, excuse me. It is kind of a mouthful. The most important thing to keep in mind is that PFAS does not refer to one specific chemical. It is a family of synthetic chemicals. Estimates vary, but we're talking anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 different chemicals that meet this definition. You've probably heard them referred to as forever chemicals, and maybe some of you have seen this movie called Dark Waters. It's like the Aaron Brockovich 2.0. Talks about a lot of issues related to water contamination from a DuPont facility on the East Coast. That was a pretty well acclaimed film not too long ago. So these chemicals were developed back in the 1940s. Some of the big players in these early years include Minnesota's own 3M. Scotchgard, one of 3M's kind of flagship products, was one of the early PFAS kind of related products that entered the market. You've probably heard of Teflon. That is a DuPont proprietary name that is also comprised largely of PFAS. And why are we seeing these out in the world? Like, what is the value that these substances provide? They're prized for their durability. They resist heat, they resist oil. They are found in a lot of products that we use every day. They are found in cookware, for example, with Teflon. Textiles, so raincoats, things that resist water, commonly have PFAS in them. Carpets. Firefighting foam is a big one. Those are foams that firefighters will commonly use for training exercises and on the scene to put out fires. Those are often PFAS laced. And then we've also seen them in things like cosmetics, fertilizers. We're seeing them all over the place. One thing that is somewhat alarming is that we are still just kind of learning about how ubiquitous these chemicals are. But we know that they are all over the world because of where we are seeing PFAS pop up. We've seen PFAS in the blood of polar bears, for example. It's been detected in rainwater in the Arctic. Basically, every corner of the earth has some detectable level of PFAS in it. So, not great. So again, these are problematic because they are prized for their durability. They do not break down in the environment. They do not naturally degrade with time, or they do so extremely slowly. And they also have this bioaccumulative factor, which think of kind of mercury and fish. A lot of birds will eat the fish, and the small fish will eat, or the large fish will eat the bigger fish. And as you move up the food chain, the risks of mercury poisoning become more acute. Similar type of effect with PFAS. They reside long in your body, so if you drink water that has trace amounts of PFAS maybe once or twice, not that big of a deal, but if you're doing it for 5 years, that's a problem. So what are those concerns? We're still learning about what the public health concerns are. I do want to emphasize that the science in this area is relatively young. It's still emerging. We are seeing a lot of really interesting and exciting work to uncover the health risks associated with consuming PFAS. But I've listed here some of the kind of more, the stronger connections that public health scientists have been able to reveal to us. So we have some immunological issues related to lower antibody levels for diphtheria, tetanus, and other commonly known diseases. And I always find this interesting. We have seen reduced vaccine efficacy. We all showed our vaccine cards as we walked in today, and there's strong science linking PFAS contamination with lowered vaccine efficacy. So that is of extreme importance in today's world. Liver-related diseases are also connected with PFAS consumption, high cholesterol, and then low birth weight, behavioral changes, bone variations, and these are especially prevalent in sensitive populations like infants. It can pass through breast milk, so mothers that are breastfeeding their infants are, it's a concern to be passing along these chemicals to these sensitive populations. I also want to talk just briefly about, first, before I do that, there are two main pathways. I've talked a few times about drinking water. This is the common way that PFAS enters the human body by consuming it from the tap. You also can consume PFAS, or people can consume PFAS by eating fish that are residing in surface waters that are contaminated with PFAS. So I'll talk about this in a second, but the East Metro area of the Twin Cities here has a large PFAS contamination zone stretching from Cottage Grove to Afton, Woodbury, for example. And Lake Elmo, the ubiquitous Lake Elmo in the city of Lake Elmo, is so contaminated with PFAS that the Department of Health has issued like a no-eat warning advisory for all species of fish because of the risk of PFAS contamination. And there are many waters across the metro and across the state that have similar health advisories from the Department of Health related to the fish. So again, all of this is relatively new. It's pretty evolving, and I like to cite some of the Department of Health guidance values. We, MCEA, had the pleasure of listening to a senior Department of Health scientist talk about PFAS, and he wanted to emphasize just how quickly the agency had reacted. And he's never seen anything like this before. So in 2002, the Minnesota Department of Health set its guidance values for one PFAS compound. This is PFOA. This is the one, I believe that was in Scotchgard. No, excuse me, this is more of the Teflon one. But so PFOA and PFOS are kind of these legacy PFAS that we think of, again, the Scotchgards and the Teflons. So these are 2 of the 5,000 or 10,000 different chemicals. But since these have been around for so long, they're the ones that are best studied. So they're kind of benchmarks and indicators for how the rest of the PFAS compounds will be kind of evaluated. So in 2002, MDH set its guidance value, and this was a non-binding health advisory level, just kind of a warning, for 7 parts per billion. So I'm going to do the drops in a swimming pool type of exercise so we can all ground ourselves here. But 1 part per billion is, or excuse me, yeah, I think 1 part per billion is like 1 drop of water in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So the Department of Health in 2002 said you can have 7 drops of water, 7 drops of PFOA in your swimming pool, and you're fine. But if you have 8, that's too much. Again, that was in 2002. So fast forward 10 years later, and the Department of Health has made 5 adjustments to that level. And now we are at 0.035 parts per billion. So less than 1 drop, less than 1/10 of a drop. I'm really bad at fractions and math. So I'll just say a lot less than 7 drops of water. And the EPA has adjusted its guidance values. These are non-binding. These are the health advisory kind of levels. And now we are in the parts per quadrillion level. So I don't have a good analogy besides swimming pools. So I'm just going to say it's a lot of swimming pools. So the EPA has announced for PFOA, this is that same one I referred to with the Department of Health, that we are now at 4 parts per quadrillion. So it's in the parts per billion is 1,000 times greater than a parts per quadrillion. So we're thinking 1,000 swimming pools, you can have 4 drops of water, essentially. The point of all this is extremely low concentrations of PFAS are not good. So I talked about prevalence, how they're found everywhere. The other main issue here is that PFAS are extremely difficult to remove from the environment. This carbon-fluorine bond that is the signature of PFAS is extremely difficult to break down. This is one of the strongest bonds that we have in chemistry. We are excited to learn that Minnesota, through proceeds obtained from the 3M settlement, which I'll touch upon here in a little bit, have been able to purchase state-of-the-art equipment to remediate some of the PFAS contamination in some of these East Metro waters and in groundwater. And it's a 2-part process. The first part is to kind of create a foam that can separate the PFAS from the water itself. And then that PFAS is scraped off and then brought to a different area where it's subjected to this electrochemical oxidation. So we're not able to break these bonds unless we subject it to extreme high temperatures and pressure, which is the problem here. They don't break down and they're really difficult to remove even with modern technology. So we're here to talk about the Clean Water Act. So how can the Clean Water Act help? I do want to emphasize that this is a holistic approach. The EPA is trying to look at this broadly and not really focus in on one element or the other. And to the EPA's credit, they have, again, with the new administration, they have really announced and are intending to take some significant steps to help fight this fight against PFAS. So we talked earlier, Joy talked earlier about water quality criteria and others on that first panel. So Under Section 4 of the Clean Water Act, the EPA is required to, from time to time, publish and revise these water quality criteria that accurately reflect the latest scientific understanding. So EPA has made its intent to set water quality criteria for aquatic life and for human health. So aquatic life is going first. So earlier this year in May, EPA announced its kind of baseline figures, its kind of draft figures, if you will. And in so doing, it's explained that, again, I want to say that this is just for PFOA and PFOS. So unless I say otherwise, we're only talking about those two. And that's kind of the elephant in the room here. But for PFOA and PFOS, EPA stated that they have no biologically important functions or beneficial properties to aquatic life. So in so stating that, the draft figures that EPA mentioned or that EPA announced are, again, we're in the parts per trillion level, 8.4 for PFOS and 94 for PFOA. So this is the amount of that chemical in a water body that is, what's the word here, that is able to sustain aquatic life. So EPA is saying that concentrations above those parts per trillion levels is not able to sustain aquatic life. So those draft figures have been published for comment. The public comment period was extended a few times, but it closed earlier this summer. And we expect EPA to make a final kind of level on its water quality criteria for aquatic life here sometime soon. So EPA has also signaled its intent to set water quality criteria for human health. So these are levels of chemicals or conditions in a water body that are not expected to cause adverse effects to human health. So this is going second. We haven't heard a lot from EPA about what it expects to do here, but we have some kind of hints about where this number will go. So when EPA is setting these numbers, it looks at the drinking water rate, the bioaccumulation factor, consumption rate, and it's also looking at those health advisory levels that I spoke about earlier that were in the parts per quadrillion level. So we don't really know what EPA will do here. It's expected to announce its values in 2024, so still a few years out. But some commentators that I've been following expect EPA to be in the kind of low parts per trillion or high parts per quadrillion level, which, just taking a step back, I mean, parts per quadrillion is incredibly small. One of the kind of walls that our regulators are running up against is that we just can't really be testing to that level. It's just a lot of noise. And if you're trying to discern something at a parts per quadrillion level, the accuracy and your ability to do so is extremely limited. I also want to talk about NPDES permitting, or the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. Again, you've heard about this earlier today. This, again, refers to point sources discharging pollutants into waters of the state or waters of the U.S. So EPA has signaled its requests for permit writers. So in Minnesota, that would be the states kind of write those state NPDES permits to include PFAS monitoring in those permits. So requiring the dischargers to at least try to study how much PFAS are being discharged in their effluent. And then related, they are also asking the permit writers to put in effluent limitation guidelines. And these are those that are based on kind of the technology and, you know, whether it's a new source or whether it is a retrofitted source, but really trying to get a handle of this situation by better understanding where these chemicals are coming from and how they are entering our waterways through discharges from point sources. Last, the EPA does have the authority to designate substances as toxic or hazardous. EPA has issued a draft rule that does designate PFOA and PFOS, again, those two legacy PFAS that are best understood, as a hazardous substance under CERCLA. And this would enable EPA to hold polluters accountable and to better take enforcement action. So real quickly, other efforts to address PFAS, you know, I did mention that one of the main pathways to entry is through drinking water, and the Clean Water Act does not regulate drinking water. That is the Safe Drinking Water Act. But again, EPA is trying to look at all of this holistically, and EPA is expecting to announce draft maximum contaminant level limits for PFOA and PFOS The MCLs are those federally enforceable limits that every public water system will have to adhere to. So this will undergo an extremely lengthy notice and comment period, and then there's a 3-year compliance period. I expect some litigation to result, so we won't expect any MCL through the Safe Drinking Water Act for a number of years. There's also state and federal legislation. Minnesota, for example, recently banned PFAS in food packaging beginning January 1st of 2024. Maine has taken it much further and is doing a phased ban of all PFAS in the state of Maine that will be finalized in 2030. There are carve-outs for some essential uses like in the medical device industry and other types of uses, but Maine is taking a really strict approach with getting PFAS out of its borders. And then there is a lot of litigation. So I mentioned the state of Minnesota against 3M. The state sued 3M for discharges in the East Metro area in 2018. It received $850 million as a part of a settlement, and it's been spending that money to try to remediate the contamination in the East Metro. There's also private class and collective action. One notable one in Ohio is against 3M. And there was a huge putative class action that was any person in the United States that has detectable level of PFAS in their blood, which again could basically be anybody. And I find this interesting. The remedy that was being sought was not monetary damages. They were requesting 3M pay for biomonitoring and other health monitoring for people that have PFAS in their blood. The Ohio Federal Court certified a narrower class. But recently, the Sixth Circuit agreed to view that class certification ruling in an interlocutory review. So, that's never a good sign for us plaintiff class action lawyers or in my prior life. So we'll see what happens there. But I do want to conclude with this is something that is still relatively new. And I've been talking a lot about PFOA and PFOS. And again, there's thousands of these chemicals that are not being studied or are being studied to a much lower degree. And then one final nugget I'll leave you with, and hopefully this doesn't keep you up at night, is that in response to a lot of this, science coming out a number of years ago, industry was like, oh, okay, you got us. That was bad. We'll tinker with the chemicals and put out these new ones that have the same kind of benefits, but don't have those public health concerns. They were colloquially referred to as Gen X. And EPA has recently released some guidance figures for Gen X. And they're just as bad, or maybe not just as bad, but they're in the realm of badness. So, the takeaway here is that we can't expect industry to kind of innovate and solve this problem for us. It's going to take a lot of hard work. I know, right? Surprising. It's going to take a lot of hard work and many years before we see some significant improvements here. So thank you so much for today, and hopefully we have some questions before we wrap up this CLE.
Here's that one for you.
All right. So this first question I've got is, did the parties argue the mootness issue to the Supreme Court? I don't think so. I think the only certified question that went up to the Supreme Court, the only question on review was the one that I identified there. And that's the only issue that was identified. So presumably the mootness issue was not presented to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can always decide that a particular matter is not justiciable. But I don't think that'll happen in this particular case. The Ninth Circuit's ruling with respect to mootness turned on the notion that to the extent that there was an argument that the matter was moot, it was moot because of the voluntary action of the government in dismissing the administrative compliance order. And the standard rule there is when mootness is based on the voluntary actions of one of the actors, it really has to be absolutely clear that this isn't going to happen again. And of course, because administrations change, who's to say that the next administration wouldn't say, you know what, actually we think maybe we should take an enforcement action. So it's not that surprising, I think, that the Ninth Circuit decided that the case was not moot. And as far as I'm aware, that did not make it up to the Supreme Court.
All right, this one I think is for Jay. And it's, I think, a question about should we buy nonstick
cookware?
Yeah, Jay.
Cast iron all the way. No, I mean, so most cookware now, if you go to your, restaurant supply company or Macy's, it will usually say PFOA free or PFOS free. That is pretty common now. Again, is there another PFAS that's sprayed on it or otherwise applied? Probably. But, it doesn't seem that there's, at least I haven't seen a lot of associated risks with eating food that comes into contact with PFAS, or excuse me, with the cookware. The problem with the cookware is it gets thrown away, it ends up in a landfill, and then other cookware in the landfill, the leachate has PFAS in it, and now it's leaching into the groundwater. So, I think you can feel fairly confident buying a new nonstick pan at your, local store, but there are other options available that perhaps you don't have to worry about that.
All right, this one's for Sarah.
Okay.
There you go, Sarah.
Thanks.
Why are we ignoring the treaties?
I ask this every day. The proposed polymet mining operation clearly violates the 1854 treaty we made with sovereign tribal nations, since it would be constructed on lands governed by treaties, legally binding. Why are the treaties ignored? Who is paying the legal costs borne by the tribes? Again, yes. This is why I do this work. Treaty rights cases, we pick very, very carefully. Polymet is not going to be driving how we choose and whether we choose to make a claim. You see a lot for that reason of language about why this area and this land is so important and in the briefings, but you do not see a claim that says this is a taking of an enforceable property right, for example, which is one of the ways that some treaty cases are framed. And I'm not taking any position about what the 54 treaty says or doesn't say about how tribes who have rights under it could proceed if they wanted to push litigation. But I frequently, and one of the issues that we think about on the tribal side in terms of legal strategy is, well, there are a lot of examples of off reservation, especially where, we have this wild rice water. We have members who go there and harvest every year. X, Y, or Z is happening, whether it's, a discharge or somebody putting in a dock and, whether they should have or not, pulling out the rice that's growing at the edge of their land. Or if we're talking about, permits that we could or would or have or would like to oppose, for an operation that we would argue does have some impacts, we have to pick and choose. And we also don't have agreement. We don't have a complete agreement on every aspect of what it means to have those rights. Tribes, and I will argue all day long that those rights aren't just if and when there might possibly still be rice in a given water or deer to harvest or medicine to gather. We would argue that those rights include protection of those potential and actual resources themselves, access as well as maintenance of the resource. But that's a fight that really hasn't it's not fully matured in a lot of respects. And so, it remains, and the co-management that tribes, the 1854 tribes undertake with the state is a pretty hard one. It's the product of agreement in a lot of years prior to that of litigation. There's a lot of potential evolution, I think, on these issues, and a lot of change we'd like to see, but aren't really there yet. So that was a long-winded way of saying, why are the treaties ignored? I don't know.
I gave Matt a longer question about the WOTUS interim rule.
Yeah. So thank you for this. So the last slide I had in my presentation talked about the fact that EPA is working on another new rule, but in the meantime, it is adopting an interim rule to basically turn back the waters of the United States definition to 2015. So it's actually two rules. One that we're going to get soon that's going to try to take us back to 2015, and then this second rule whose content we don't really know very much about yet because it's still in development. And the question is, how will the finalization of the back to 2015 rule affect the forthcoming SACIT decision? I don't know.
Come on.
I don't think it will. I mean, I think to the extent that what EPA is going to do is say we should go back to what it said in 2015, the Supreme Court still gets to say, oh yeah, but that was wrong, or oh yeah, that was right. I mean, I think the Supreme Court is still kind of in the driver's seat, and the Supreme Court kind of has a choice to make here about whether it will continue to be sort of holding itself out as the place at which this particular question keeps getting litigated, or whether they're maybe now at a point where they're willing to say, no, let's turn this back over to Congress and get out of this business, or turn it back over to the administration. But they're going to have to make that judgment. Right? They're going to have to make that judgment. Do we want to continue to be the venue in which we have this sort of proxy war over federalism and these other kinds of property rights and so forth? Or do we want to get out of this business once and for all? And I don't have any way of really predicting that. I mean, there are members of the court who you might think might go a certain way. Justice Kavanaugh, for example, has been saying, shouldn't we just turn this back over to Congress? So I don't know. I don't know how it'll come out. But I don't think the EPA's decision to go back to 2015 is going to have any sort of controlling effect on what the Supreme Court does. Certainly not as a legal matter, and maybe not even as sort of a influence kind of matter. That's my guess.
All right. There's one more question here I want to give Sarah a crack at, but I came over to the microphone because I wanted to weigh in myself also on this one. And the question is, can Minnesota groundwater legal protections or laws help in controlling a proposed mine that proposes only underground mining, but no processing or tailings basin in Minnesota?
Wow. This sounds like tell me more about this fantasy mine that won't have any water discharge of any kind. I'd love to hear how water doesn't flow. Yeah, and I say that because of cynical experiences. So you said the idea is, can we regulate purely as a matter of state law, because states regulate groundwater, whereas under the Clean Water Act is for surface water.
Yeah, although I think implied is, if the Clean Water Act, does that apply here too? I mean, it specifies groundwater, but yeah, I think it's, what is the regulatory mechanisms in place when the tailings and the processing is elsewhere?
Well, what do you think?
Well, I think that when you build a mine, you've got, in Minnesota, the groundwater and the surface water is all the same. Right? So when you build a mine, all of the nearby groundwater and surface water gets sucked into your mine. Yeah. It's called the cone of depression, which is one of my favorite hydrologic terms. I know. I didn't make it up. It's the cone of depression. And all the water comes in. And so you have to pump all that out. So first you've got a surface discharge from that. Right. And then you've extracted a bunch of ore and a bunch of waste rock. So your ore is going somewhere else under this hypothetical for processing, but all your waste rock is still there in piles and presumably produces runoff as a point source.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, there's no way not for these operations. I've never heard of a purely underground mine like this exactly in our setting, but certainly not an expert in all the different types of extractive industries that there are. But the experience that I have, the most experience I have around these issues comes from the MNTAC litigation, which Catherine certainly knows a lot about intimately. We want to talk about your various and sundry trespasses on the waterways. Never mind.
This is being recorded.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. No, there's. I'm thinking about specifically going up to see and understand what these sites really are, what they look like, what happens, the way that water is discharged. These are huge operations. There's seepage that comes from these tailing basins that are built up to contain the wastewater. Well, not really. I mean, the wastewater is created. The waste rock is stored in various ways basically in an area surrounded by a berm. And water is going to be directly pumped there, wastewater, or in this case, I understand we're trying to, send some of this elsewhere for processing, but there's going to be something, and it's going to rain. And there's going to be the cone of depression, and you're going to have water to deal with, water to treat or not treat, unfortunately, as is the case. Water in Minnesota typically seeps through the walls of unlined old tailings basins that are in place. It seeps directly down underground and flows through groundwater pathways and daylights downstream. Sometimes it just flows up the top. So there's just any number of ways water escapes from these operations. So, the Mintac case was kind of a good example in that respect, if anybody has an opportunity to look at it, to see how all of that happens and how it works and what it means to then deal with downstream exceedances, including in wild rice water that's not even a mile downstream, that used to be incredibly productive culturally and historically important, and is no longer, and is toxic. It's not just not harvestable. There's no rice. It's a toxic place. Like, you wouldn't fish there, you wouldn't, and eat anything. You wouldn't do anything there. And so we have this unfortunate example of how we can't really get to a clean operation, at least in my understanding and imagination.
Yeah, and not in our lifetimes, probably,
Right.
even with work. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you to our panel today. This was wonderful and very informative, hot topic. So 2 things I want to say. One is that we do have a happy hour reception. It's right underneath. So you just go down the steps and into the room that's right underneath this one. You will find that. The second thing I want to mention is that MCEA is a nonprofit. The vast majority of our resources come from individual donors. And so if you joined us here today, if you're a lawyer, you got free CLE credit. If you're not a lawyer, you got several hours of law-related entertainment that's priceless. And I understand that it's open bar downstairs. So you're getting all kinds of benefits. And we would love for you to take a moment and make a gift. This is actually a really great week for it because Thursday is Give to the Max Day. If you have not participated in Give to the Max Day, it's actually a lot of fun. It is a Minnesota specific event where sponsored through givemn.org. So that's the website. And you can go and give to your favorite nonprofits. And millions of dollars are given out on this day. It's a wonderful charitable event. You should definitely participate in it. You should go to givemn.org. You should make your biggest gift to MCEA and then make smaller gifts to other wonderful organizations that you also find on the site. And that would be very much appreciated. And we have a live match right now. So if you give, another donor will match your gift. So you get to have double your impact. So really great timing. Please do it. And thank you again to all of our wonderful panelists. Really appreciate everyone's time and work today and all of you coming to join us. So thank you.
Thanks, folks.